Hello there, my Twilight souls. Tonight, we journey through the timeline you thought you knew, but seen through eyes that witnessed every secret, heard every unspoken truth, understood every hidden motive that shaped the saga we believed we understood. Edward Cullen existed for a century before the story began, carrying buried truths about the monster who chose to transcend his nature, and the mind that heard everything except what mattered most. I know I shouldn't have to mention this, but if these stories are resonating with you, subscribing would mean the world to me. I'm aiming to build this community as we begin 2026. And it keeps me motivated to bring you more Twilight content. Now, back to our story. As you settle in, I'm curious where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. You can tell me in the comments. Alright, let's get cozy now and rest. Let Edward's hidden truths and his century of searching carry you gently into sleep, where mysteries wait to teach us what certainty never could. Edward Anthony Mason was born on the 20th of June in 1901 in Chicago, Illinois. During the height of summer, when the city sweltered under humid skies, and when industrial smoke from stockyards and factories hung thick in air, the residents learned to breathe without complaint, because prosperity and progress required certain sacrifices in comfort, and in the romantic notion that cities should smell of anything besides commerce and human density, and the machinery of American ambition reaching toward the new century that promised everything previous generations had only dreamed about achieving. His parents were Edward Sr. and Elizabeth Mason. The father, a successful lawyer, whose practice served Chicago's growing upper middle class, with reliable competence that built reputation and built wealth, sufficient to provide comfortable existence in respectable neighborhood, where physicians and attorneys and businessmen raised their families behind painted porches and manicured lawns that demonstrated their distance from immigrant tenements and working-class districts that pressed against better neighborhoods, with constant threat of urban expansion and social mixing that made established families nervous about maintaining their status. Elizabeth Mason was educated and cultured in the way that women of her class and generation could be. Her intelligence channeled into managing household and into raising her only child with focused maternal ambition that saw in her son the possibility of greatness that she herself could never pursue, given the limitations that society placed on female aspiration beyond marriage and motherhood, and careful cultivation of social connections that might advance family standing. She adored Edward with fierce protective love that only children inspire in parents who have poured all reproductive hope into a single vessel. Her dreams for his future encompassing everything from academic excellence to social prominence to brilliant career that would make the Mason name notable beyond their immediate circle of acquaintance in the city that was growing too fast and too large for individual families to maintain lasting prominence. Edward was precocious from early childhood in ways that delighted his mother and occasionally puzzled his father, who loved his son, but who found the boy's artistic sensibilities and passionate attachment to music somewhat impractical for someone being groomed for legal profession or business career that would require different talents than those displayed by a child who could hear melody once and reproduce it perfectly on the piano that dominated the Mason parlor, and that became Edward's primary domain. From the moment his small fingers first discovered they could coax sounds from ivory keys that fascinated him more than toys or games, or the rough outdoor activities that other boys his age pursued with enthusiasm, he never quite managed to summon for anything except music. He began piano lessons at age 6 with an instructor who quickly recognized genuine talent rather than simple facility. His progress rapid enough that Elizabeth began entertaining fantasies of concert halls and European training and perhaps professional musical career if Edward's interests continued in that direction, and if his father could be persuaded that music represented legitimate aspiration rather than pleasant hobby that gentleman might pursue alongside more serious professional occupation. The year 1918 arrived with America at war in Europe. The Great War that had been consuming the continent since 1914, finally drawing the United States into conflict that President Wilson had initially promised to avoid, but that submarine warfare and strategic calculation and momentum of events had made inevitable despite isolationist impulses that had characterized American foreign policy since the founding. Edward was 17 years old as the war dominated newspapers, and as young men enlisted or were drafted to fight in trenches that would kill millions and would traumatize a generation and would destroy optimistic progressivism that had characterized the pre-war era's faith in human improvement and rational progress toward more enlightened civilization. September of 1918 brought the Spanish influenza to Chicago with devastating force that overwhelmed hospitals and that killed with speed and with apparent randomness that made the pandemic terrifying in ways that distant war could never quite achieve for civilians who remained safe at home while soldiers died overseas. The influenza was democratic in its lethality, unlike most diseases that primarily killed the very young or very old or already weak. This virus seeming to particularly target healthy adults in their prime, whose strong immune systems paradoxically made them more vulnerable to cytokine storms that turned their own defenses against them and that filled their lungs with fluid and that killed them within days or sometimes within hours of initial symptoms appearing. Edward Sr. fell ill first in late September, his robust health and his 50 years of life offering no protection against virus that attacked without regard for status or wealth or comfortable assumption that respectable families in respectable neighborhoods should be spared the kinds of tragedies that afflicted the poor in their crowded tenements where disease always found easy purchase. He declined rapidly from initial fever and cough to respiratory distress and hemorrhaging that characterized worse cases, his death coming within 3 days of first symptoms and leaving Elizabeth and Edward shocked by speed, with which vigorous man could be reduced to corpse that overwhelmed undertakers barely had resources to handle given volume of death that was transforming Chicago into a city of mourning, where funeral bells rang constantly. Within days of Edward Sr.'s death, both Elizabeth and Edward began showing symptoms that initially seemed like ordinary grief-related exhaustion, or perhaps simple colds that would pass with rest and with home remedies that Elizabeth had always relied upon for minor illnesses. But fevers climbed too high and coughs became too severe and weakness became too profound for either of them to maintain pretense that they were suffering from anything except influenza that had killed Edward's father and that was killing thousands across the city. As hospitals overflowed and as physicians worked without rest, trying to save patients that virus killed faster than medicine could counter with any effective treatment. Elizabeth recognized what was happening to them and recognized that they were both going to die. Her maternal instinct surviving even terminal illness and focusing all remaining energy on desperate plan to save her son, even if she herself could not be saved from virus that was systematically destroying her body from inside, while leaving her conscious enough to understand exactly what was happening and to understand that she had perhaps days or perhaps only hours remaining before respiratory failure would make breathing impossible and would end her life the same way it had ended her husband's life, the same way it was, ending thousands of lives across Chicago and across world in pandemic that would ultimately kill more people than war had killed. Through 4 years of industrial slaughter in European trenches, Dr. Carlisle Cullen was working night shift at the hospital where Elizabeth and Edward had been brought, when their conditions deteriorated beyond what home care could manage. His presence in Chicago, part of a perpetual wandering that characterized his existence as vampire who worked as physician wherever human need was greatest and wherever he could serve, without remaining long enough for anyone to notice that he never aged and never ate and never appeared vulnerable to diseases that surrounded him constantly in his medical work. He had been transformed in 1663 by a vampire who had intended him as meal, but who had been interrupted mid-feeding, and who had fled, leaving Carlisle writhing in transformation, that he survived alone and confused until he emerged as vampire who discovered to his horror what he had become and what his nature now demanded he do to survive. Elizabeth recognized what Carlisle was during one of his visits to check on Edward's deteriorating condition. Her fevered perception somehow penetrating careful facade he maintained to pass as human among hospital staff who saw only competent physician working tirelessly to save patients that conventional medicine was powerless to save. She called him to her bedside during night when Edward was unconscious with fever, and when she knew that both of them were dying, and that conventional medicine offered no hope, and that her only chance to save her son lay in supernatural creature who was masquerading as doctor, and who might have power to save Edward, even if saving him meant transforming him into something no longer human. Her request was desperate and direct in a way that dying mothers can be when their children's lives hang in balance, and when supernatural intervention seems preferable to certain death regardless of what that intervention might cost or might require. "Save him," she said, her hand gripping Carlisle's with surprising strength for someone so close to death. "Do whatever it takes. He's my only son. Promise me you'll save him." Carlisle understood exactly what she was asking, and exactly what she knew about what he was. Her recognition somehow complete despite fever, and despite delirium that affected most influenza patients in their final hours. He had never transformed another vampire during his 255 years of existence, his solitary existence partly choice and partly consequence of his belief that creating another vampire meant condemning someone to same cursed existence he endured, and meant taking responsibility for another being's eternal suffering in immortal form that precluded normal human life and normal human death. But Elizabeth's plea and Edward's imminent death, and perhaps his own loneliness after centuries of existing without companion who shared his values and his commitment to preserving human life despite vampire nature, combined to make him consider what he had always refused to consider before this moment in this overcrowded hospital ward, where death was routine, and where one more death would be noticed by no one except Mother, who was herself dying. Edward's last human memories were fragmentary and fevered, his consciousness fading in and out as a virus attacked his respiratory system and attacked his brain through high fever that created hallucinations and created confusion about what was real and what was fever dream. He remembered his father's death with crystal clarity despite fever, remembered his mother's face as she held his hand and told him everything would be fine, even though he could hear in her voice that she was lying and that nothing would be fine, and that they were both going to die the same way his father had died. He remembered hospital sounds and hospital smells and sense of drowning as his lungs filled with fluid and as breathing became harder, and as his body shut down system by system the way virus had been designed by evolution or by chance to kill with maximum efficiency. What Edward did not remember was Carlyle's decision or Carlyle's actions. The vampire physician waiting until Elizabeth Mason died peacefully in her sleep before moving Edward's unconscious body from hospital to Carlyle's private rooms, where transformation could occur without witnesses and without risk. That Edward's screams during 3-day process would alert hospital staff, or would create questions about what was happening to patient who had been removed from ward for reasons that Carlyle's authority as physician made possible to arrange without excessive scrutiny. The bite happened while Edward was unconscious, Carlyle's venom entering Edward's bloodstream and beginning transformation that would rewrite every cell in his body and would stop his heart and would kill him as human while recreating him as vampire, whose existence would span decades and centuries and potentially millennia if he survived dangerous early years when newborn vampires were most vulnerable to making mistakes that exposed their nature or that brought them into conflict with other vampires who might destroy them. The transformation began its work immediately, venom spreading through Edward's dying body and claiming it for immortal existence before death could complete its natural process. Virus that had been killing him becoming irrelevant as vampire venom rewrote his biology into something that viruses could not affect and that disease could not touch, because vampire bodies did not function according to mortal rules. The fever that had been burning him gave way to different fire that consumed him from inside as venom worked its transformation cell by cell, tissue by tissue, system by system, until nothing human remained except consciousness that survived process, and that would wake in 3 days to find itself housed in body that was recognizably Edward Mason. But that was fundamentally different in every measurable way from human body that had been dying of influenza just days earlier. Edward woke on 4th day to discover he had died and been reborn. His first conscious thoughts confused by absence of pain that he had grown accustomed to during transformation, and confused by sensory input that overwhelmed him with information about room and about Carlyle's presence and about sounds from street outside that he could hear with perfect clarity despite walls and despite distance that should have made such hearing impossible. He could smell everything with intensity that made simple act of breathing an assault of information. Each scent distinct and identifiable and carrying data about its source that his human nose had never detected and had never processed with this level of detail that made world seem entirely new, despite his memories of how world had looked and smelled and sounded when he had been human just days ago, according to calendar, but eternally ago, according to his subjective experience of having been transformed so completely that human existence seemed like distant memory. The gift of telepathy manifested immediately upon waking. Edward's first awareness of voices that were not spoken aloud coming from Carlyle's mind, as the older vampire watched him wake and wondered whether Edward would adjust successfully to his new existence, or whether Edward would struggle with the transformation the way Carlyle himself had struggled when he had been newly made and alone and terrified of what he had become. Edward heard Carlyle's thoughts before he understood what he was hearing. The stream of consciousness from another mind flowing into Edward's awareness as though it belonged there, and as though telepathy was a natural extension of hearing, rather than supernatural gift that made Edward unique among vampires and made him valuable in ways that would complicate his existence for decades to come. The 1920s arrived with Edward already chafing against restrictions that Carlyle's vegetarian lifestyle imposed on his existence. The young vampire's intellect and his gift making him acutely aware of philosophical contradictions and moral ambiguities that Carlyle preferred to resolve through simple commitment to not killing humans regardless of whether that commitment made logical sense, according to any framework except personal conviction that killing was wrong, even when killer was predator and killed were prey, according to every natural law and every evolutionary principle that governed relationships between species occupying different positions in food chain. Edward had spent his first years as vampire learning control and learning to hunt animals and learning to exist among humans without revealing his nature or succumbing to bloodlust that made every human heartbeat sound like dinner bell and made every human scent trigger predatory instincts that transformation had embedded in his new body. The philosophical arguments between Carlyle and Edward began casually during their conversations about ethics and about nature of their existence. Edward's questions initially seeming like intellectual exercises rather than genuine challenges to lifestyle that Carlyle had maintained for over 250 years without deviation. Edward argued that Carlyle's vegetarianism represented arbitrary moral stance that had no foundation except personal squeamishness or perhaps religious conditioning from Carlyle's human life that had ended in 1663, but that apparently still governed his choices centuries later, despite transformation having theoretically freed him from human limitations and human moral frameworks that should not apply to creatures who were no longer human. 1927 marked Edward's departure from Carlyle, the separation painful for both of them but necessary from Edward's perspective if he was going to explore what vampire existence meant when lived according to vampire nature, rather than according to human moral framework that Carlyle insisted on maintaining. Carlyle did not try to stop him or to force him to stay. his philosophy extending to respecting free will and respecting Edward's need to make his own choices even when those choices would lead to actions that Carlyle himself would never take. The decade that followed was Edward's education in reality of human evil and in complexity of moral judgment that seemed straightforward in theory, but that became muddled when applied to actual human beings whose minds Edward could read and whose lives Edward could end with casual ease. He travelled across northern United States during these years, moving from city to city as he hunted and as he avoided staying anywhere long enough to create patterns that might draw attention. The wife-beater in Milwaukee died in alley behind bar where he had spent evening drinking and planning beating he would deliver to his wife when he returned home. Edward justified kill by reading man's history of violence and reading his complete lack of remorse and reading his genuine enjoyment of fear he created in woman who loved him or who had loved him before violence had transformed that love into survival mechanism. The child predator in Minneapolis died in his own home, where Edward found him planning his next victim. The man's thoughts so vile and so detailed about what he intended to do that Edward killed him with rage that surprised him with its intensity. The corrupt businessman in Detroit died after Edward spent weeks reading his mind and cataloguing his crimes that ranged from financial fraud to blackmail to ordering violence against competitors and against former associates who threatened to expose his illegal activities. The psychological toll of these kills accumulated despite Edward's attempts to maintain emotional distance and to view his victims as abstractions deserving of death, rather than as complete human beings whose minds contained more than just evil that had marked them for his attention. He discovered that reading minds during final moments of life gave him access to everything dying person had ever experienced or ever thought, their memories flooding into his consciousness as their brains shut down. He saw their childhoods and saw their loves and saw their moments of kindness and saw their ordinary humanity that existed alongside evil that had brought them to Edward's attention. The realization grew gradually across years that even evil humans contain complexity and contain humanity that made them more than simple categories of guilty versus innocent. That minds he read before killing revealed people who had made choices and had been shaped by circumstances and had struggled with varying degrees of success against influences that sometimes overwhelmed whatever better impulses they possessed. The corruption of his gift troubled him more than killing itself troubled him. His recognition that he was using telepathy to justify actions he wanted to take anyway, rather than using it as objective tool for identifying evil, making him question whether his entire rationalization was sophisticated self-deception. The growing emptiness surprised him with its intensity, his expectation having been that feeding on humans would feel more natural and would feel more satisfying than animal blood that Carlyle consumed with resignation. But human blood provided no existential satisfaction beyond physical pleasure of feeding and temporary cessation of thirst. His kills, leaving him feeling hollow rather than righteous, and leaving him with accumulated weight of human memories and human lives that crowded his consciousness and made his own identity feel diluted by constant exposure to other minds. 1931 brought him back to Carlyle after approximately 4 years of rebellion and approximately 100 human deaths that Edward could count precisely and could remember individually in ways that made statistical summary feel inadequate to capture psychological reality of having ended that many lives. The return happened without dramatic confrontation or without explicit admission of failure. Edward simply arriving at whatever city Carlyle was currently residing in and presenting himself with humility that Carlyle received with forgiveness, that asked no questions about where Edward had been or what Edward had done during their separation. The renewed commitment to vegetarian lifestyle was genuine and was lasting. Edward's experience with human blood having taught him that Carlyle's way was wisdom rather than weakness, and that vampire nature could be transcended or at least managed through will and through commitment to values that existence as predator did not automatically erase. The permanent guilt about approximately 100 deaths he had caused became part of his character and became part of his self-conception as damned soul, who had chosen damnation through his own actions, rather than having damnation imposed upon him by transformation he had not chosen. 1933 brought Esme into Edward's existence when Carlyle transformed woman who had attempted suicide by jumping off cliff after losing her infant son to lung infection. Her grief so complete and so devastating that death seemed preferable to continuing existence in a world that had taken everything she loved. Edward gained mother figure for first time since Elizabeth Mason had died in 1918. Esme's gentle nature and her capacity for love surviving transformation and emerging in vampire form as same maternal warmth and same nurturing instinct that had made her devoted mother during brief time she had been allowed to parent before tragedy had stolen that role. 1935 brought Rosalie Hale into family through Carlyle's decision to transform young woman who had been gang raped and left dying in street by her fiancé and his friends after evening of drinking and violence that had destroyed Rosalie's human life. Carlyle had hoped that Edward and Rosalie might form romantic attachment. His vision of vampire family including couples and including possibility that Edward's eternal solitude might end through connection with beautiful vampire woman. But Edward's complete disinterest in Rosalie romantically became apparent immediately upon meeting her. His telepathy giving him access to her thoughts and revealing vanity and bitterness and obsessive focus on her lost humanity that dominated her internal landscape. 1940 brought Emmett McCarthy into family through Rosalie's desperate appeal to Carlyle after she found young man being mauled by bear in mountains of Tennessee. Edward felt genuine happiness at Rosalie finally finding her mate, his telepathy showing him depth of her feelings for Emmett and showing him Emmett's reciprocal adoration that gave Rosalie validation and love she'd been seeking since her transformation. The family dynamic shifted to accommodate two couples, with Edward remaining solitary figure, whose lack of romantic attachment made him odd one out in family structure. 1950 brought Alice Brandon and Jasper Whitlock to family through Alice's precognitive vision that had shown her exactly where to find Cullens and exactly when to arrive with Jasper in tow. Edward discovered in Alice and Jasper something he had not had since Carlyle. Vampire siblings whose gifts matched his own in significance and in power, their telepathy and precognition and empathy creating triumvirate of mental abilities that made Cullen family formidable beyond their numbers. The year 2004 brought Cullens to Forks, Washington for another cycle of high school attendance that had become routine across decades of moving from place to place every few years to avoid suspicion that would inevitably arise when family members never aged. Edward had perfected his performance of humanity across decades since his transformation. His routine of playing bronze-haired, mysterious, untouchable student requiring minimal effort. At this point in his existence, when he had attended high school so many times that he could predict with perfect accuracy how his presence would be received. Human girls held no interest for him, and romantic entanglements with humans violated carefully maintained boundaries that kept families safe from exposure. Edward had resigned himself to eternal solitude, believing after nearly 90 years as vampire that love was not meant for monsters who heard every thought and who knew too much about human darkness to believe that connection was possible. January of 2005 would prove him catastrophically wrong. Alice's visions began in early January of 2005 with disturbing precognitive images that shattered the comfortable predictability that had characterized the Cullen family's first months in Forks. The futures she saw branching into two distinct possibilities that diverged based on decisions that had not yet been made, and that would not be made until after the catalyst arrived in the small town where Edward had settled into another cycle of monotonous high school attendance, expecting nothing to change and expecting no disruption to the carefully controlled existence he had maintained for decades. The first future showed Edward killing a human girl whose face Alice could not see clearly, but whose death would come through Edward's loss of control in ways that suggested the girl's blood would call to him with intensity that would overwhelm his discipline and would shatter the vegetarian lifestyle he had maintained since 1931, when he had returned to Carlisle humbled and broken by his rebellion decade. The second future showed Edward with this same girl in some undefined relationship that Alice could not see clearly, because the decisions leading to that future remained unmade and remained uncertain in ways that made the visions fragmentary and made the outcome impossible to predict, with the certainty that Alice's gift usually provided when futures were more clearly determined by present choices and present circumstances. Edward dismissed both visions with the arrogance of someone who believed he had mastered control after decades of existing among humans, without losing discipline or without experiencing temptation that exceeded his ability to manage through will and through commitment to the vegetarian lifestyle that had become his identity and his moral foundation. He had sat next to countless human girls in countless biology classes across his various high school attendances, had smelled their blood and had heard their thoughts, and had successfully maintained the boundaries that kept them safe from the predator sitting beside them, taking notes and pretending to learn material he had mastered generations before they were born. Another human girl arriving in Forks represented no threat that Edward could perceive, his confidence in his own discipline making him underestimate the danger that Bella Swan would represent, and making him unprepared for the intensity of the bloodlust that would hit him when her scent first reached him in the biology classroom, where fate or chance or simply unlucky scheduling had assigned them to be lab partners for the spring semester that was beginning on January 18th. The family's concern about Alice's warnings manifested in various ways, depending on each member's personality and their individual relationships with Edward. Carlisle's thoughts revealing cautious worry mixed with faith in Edward's control and faith in Edward's commitment, to their shared values. Esme's maternal anxiety about Edward's safety and about the possibility that this unknown girl might somehow hurt her son or might create a situation that would force them to leave Fawkes before they had barely settled into the community. Rosalie's irritation that Edward's potential drama might disrupt the comfortable life she had established and might force another premature departure from location she found acceptable. Emmett's amused interest in the possibility that Edward might finally find someone who interested him after decades of refusing every opportunity for romance, and Jasper's empathic awareness of the tension that Alice's visions had created in the family dynamic, even though the details remained vague and the outcomes remained uncertain, until the girl actually arrived, and until Edward's first encounter with her revealed which future would manifest through his choices and through circumstances beyond anyone's control. Edward heard all their thoughts and heard all their concerns and dismissed them with the same arrogance that made him believe that another human girl would be no different from the thousands of human girls he had successfully ignored across his decades of living among humanity without forming attachments or forming connections that would complicate the careful performance of normalcy that allowed the Cullens to exist in human society without drawing attention or without creating the kind of relationships that would make their eventual departure painful or their unchanging appearances noticeable. He had perfected the role of the mysterious, untouchable student who was polite but distant and who deflected interest without being cruel, his telepathy allowing him to predict how humans would respond to various behaviors and allowing him to calibrate his interactions to maintain precisely the right amount of social connection to avoid seeming strange, while never encouraging the kind of intimacy that would create problems when the family needed to move again in a few years. January 18th of 2005 arrived as ordinary Wednesday when the spring semester began at Fawkes High School, and when the new student from Phoenix, Arizona arrived to live with her father after her mother's remarriage created living situation that apparently made Bella's presence in Phoenix inconvenient or unwanted or simply impractical, given whatever circumstances had prompted her mother to send her teenage daughter to live with father she barely knew in town. She had actively avoided visiting for years, according to the thoughts Edward picked up from students who had heard various versions of Bella Swan's story through the efficient gossip network that characterized small-town high schools, where everyone knew everyone else's business and where new arrivals provided entertainment and provided opportunity for social repositioning as students competed to befriend the new girl, or to date the new girl, or simply to be first to gather information about her that could be shared as social currency. Edward paid minimal attention to the buzz of excitement that Bella's arrival created among the student population who found novelty in new students appearing mid-year in school, where everyone had known everyone else since elementary school and where fresh face represented break from the tedious routine of seeing the same people in the same hallways, having the same conversations about the same limited topics that characterized teenage existence in isolated town, where nothing much happened, and where visitors from larger cities like Phoenix carried exotic appeal simply by virtue of coming from somewhere else. He absorbed the information about Bella Swan through other students' thoughts during the morning classes that preceded biology, learning that she was 17 years old and shy, and apparently unaware of how pretty she was, according to Mike Newton's infatuated assessment, and according to Jessica Stanley's jealous observations, and according to Eric Yorkie's awkward interest, the male students already positioning themselves to pursue her attention, while the female students already calculating whether she represented threat to their own social positions, or whether she might become ally or friend, depending on how she navigated the complex social hierarchies that governed high school relationships. The biology class on Bella's first day began ordinarily enough, with Edward sitting at his assigned lab table, waiting for class to begin, and preparing himself for another hour of pretending to learn material he had mastered decades ago when he had first studied biology, and when he had subsequently studied it multiple additional times across his various high school attendances in different schools, where curriculum varied slightly, but where fundamental concepts remained consistent enough that genuine learning was impossible and genuine engagement was beyond his capacity after so much repetition. The classroom was warm and was crowded with 30 students whose heartbeats and whose scents created constant background noise that Edward had learned to filter through decades of practice. His control sufficient that he could exist in enclosed spaces with humans without experiencing the kind of overwhelming thirst that had characterized his early years as vampire, when every human had seemed like prey, and when restraint had required active effort rather than becoming automatic response that allowed him to function in human society without constant vigilance. The fan on the teacher's desk was rotating slowly when Bella entered the classroom, escorted by teacher, who was directing her to the office to get her slip signed before taking her seat, the moving air currents carrying her scent directly across the room to where Edward sat, unprepared for the assault on his senses that her blood would create in ways that shattered his arrogance and shattered his confidence in his control, and shattered every assumption he had made about his ability to exist safely among humans whose blood had never before called to him with intensity that made breathing impossible and made thinking impossible and made everything except the overwhelming urge to kill her completely disappear from his consciousness as instinct took over, and as every vampire impulse in his body demanded that he drink her blood and end her life to satisfy the thirst that her scent had triggered with force he had never experienced, even during his rebellious years, when he had hunted humans deliberately, and when he had tasted blood from victims he had selected for their crimes rather than for their appeal. The immediate overwhelming bloodlust that Bella's scent created was beyond anything Edward had imagined possible after decades of control, and after decades of successfully existing among humans without losing discipline or without experiencing temptation that exceeded his ability to manage through will and through commitment to the vegetarian lifestyle that had become his identity. Her blood sang to him in ways that made every previous human scent seem dull and seem easily ignorable. The specific chemistry of her blood apparently matching his particular preferences so perfectly that evolution or chance or simple bad luck had created situation where predator and ideal prey were forced into close proximity in enclosed classroom, where escape was difficult without creating scene, and where violence was impossible without exposing his nature to the 30 other students who fill the room with their heartbeats and their scents that Edward barely noticed, compared to the overwhelming presence of Bella's blood calling to every predatory instinct that transformation had embedded in his vampire nature. His physical reaction was immediate and was barely controllable, his eyes going black with thirst as venom pooled in his mouth, and as his body prepared automatically for the kill that instinct insisted was not just desirable but necessary and inevitable and right according to natural law that made vampires apex predators and made humans prey regardless of whatever moral frameworks Edward had constructed to justify resisting that natural relationship between species occupying different positions in the food chain. His hands gripped the edge of the lab table with force that would have crushed the wood if he had not carefully moderated his strength. Despite the overwhelming distraction of Bella's scent, and despite the difficulty of thinking clearly, when every nerve in his body was screaming at him to move and to kill and to drink, until the burning thirst was satisfied, and until Bella Swan was nothing except empty corpse and fading memory of the best blood he would ever taste in his entire immortal existence, that had suddenly narrowed to single point of focused desire that excluded all other considerations. He held his breath completely to avoid drawing more of her scent into his lungs, the decision to stop breathing buying him seconds of clarity to assess the situation and to recognize that killing Bella would require killing every witness in the classroom to prevent exposure, and would require abandoning Fawkes immediately, and would require destroying the life that his family had built in this location, where they had only just arrived, and where they had planned to remain for several years before moving again to start the cycle elsewhere. The calculation happened in fractions of seconds, while Bella walked to the teacher's desk, and while the teacher signed her slip, and while Edward sat frozen at the lab table, trying to decide whether to flee the classroom or whether to attempt staying through the full hour of class time that stretched ahead, like torture, designed specifically to test his control and to test his commitment to not killing humans, regardless of how intensely he wanted to kill this particular human, whose blood promised satisfaction beyond anything animal blood could ever provide. The shock of discovering that he could not read Bella's mind, added to the overwhelming assault that her scent had created, the silence where her thoughts should have been representing unprecedented experience in Edward's decades of telepathy that had given him access to every human mind he had encountered, and that had made human consciousness as familiar to him as his own internal monologue. The silence was absolute and was impenetrable, his gift apparently unable to penetrate whatever shielding or whatever unusual quality of her mind kept her thoughts hidden from his telepathic perception in ways that no human had ever managed before, and in ways that suggested she possessed natural mental shield that functioned automatically without conscious effort or conscious awareness that she was doing anything unusual or anything that would prevent vampire telepath from accessing the constant stream of consciousness that humans broadcast without knowing they were being overheard by the monster sitting next to them, pretending to be human teenager, interested in biology and interested in normal high school concerns rather than interested in calculating the most efficient method for killing entire classroom full of witnesses. The combination of irresistible scent and unreadable mind made Bella fascinating and made Bella dangerous in ways that went beyond simple bloodlust. Edward's curiosity about her thoughts warring with his thirst in complicated emotional state that made rational decision-making nearly impossible as he sat frozen at the lab table, trying to decide whether to flee the classroom or whether to attempt staying through the remainder of the period that had only just begun, and that would require him to maintain control for 50 more minutes while sitting less than 2 feet away from Human, whose blood called to him with intensity that made every second feel like hour and made every breath he didn't take feel like small victory against instinct that insisted breathing was necessary and insisted that her scent would provide pleasure that exceeded the danger of losing control completely. The barely controlled exit from the classroom happened as soon as the bell rang, ending the period, Edward fleeing to his car and driving directly out of Forks without stopping and without explaining his departure to his siblings, who would undoubtedly wonder where he had gone and would undoubtedly ask questions when he eventually returned or contacted them to explain the situation that had driven him away from school midday without warning and without the courtesy of informing them that he was leaving or that he was struggling with temptation that had proven far more intense than he had anticipated when dismissing Alice's visions as exaggerated concerns about situation he could easily handle. He drove north to Alaska, where the Denali Coven maintained residence, the sister coven to the Cullens, who shared their vegetarian lifestyle and who had become friends and occasional companions across the decades since Carlyle had first encountered them and had discovered that other vampires had independently arrived at similar conclusions about the possibility and the desirability of avoiding human prey. When animal blood could sustain vampire existence, even if it provided inferior nourishment and inferior satisfaction. The week he spent with the Denali Coven was torture of different kind than the biology classroom had been. Tanya's advances and her obvious interest in romantic relationship doing nothing to distract him from his obsession with Bella Swan and his internal debate about whether he should kill her to end the temptation or whether he should stay away from Forks permanently and let her live her human life without ever knowing how close she had come to death, simply by walking into biology classroom on her first day at new school, where the beautiful boy sitting at the lab table had wanted nothing more than to drain her blood and to end her existence in pursuit of pleasure that would last minutes and would leave him with guilt that would last centuries. The internal debate consumed him completely during his time in Alaska, his mind returning constantly to the problem of Bella Swan and to the question of what he should do about the unprecedented situation where human existed whose blood called to him so intensely that control seemed impossible and whose mind remained closed to him in ways that made her mysterious and made her infinitely more interesting than any human he had encountered across his long existence among people whose thoughts were open books. He argued with himself about whether killing her would be mercy or would be murder. His rationalization that she would die eventually anyway, as all humans died, making the timing seem less significant than it actually was given, that she was 17 years old and deserved the decades of life ahead of her, that Edward's thirst would steal if he chose his momentary satisfaction over her entire future that stretched before her, full of possibilities and full of experiences that she would never have if Edward returned to Forks and lost control and killed her to satisfy craving that animal blood could never satisfy, despite his decades of proving that survival on animal blood was possible. He considered staying away permanently and letting his family remain in Forks without him. His absence protecting Bella from danger while allowing the Cullens to maintain their carefully constructed life in the small town where Carlyle had just established his position at the local hospital, and where Esme had just begun renovating the house they had purchased as their residence for however many years they could remain before needing to move again. The rationalization for returning to Forks emerged from Edward's pride and from his conviction that he had killed humans before during his rebellious years, and had ultimately chosen not to kill humans after recognizing the moral bankruptcy of that choice. His confidence in his control making him believe that he could manage his thirst for Bella's blood, the same way he had learned to manage his thirst for human blood in general across the decades since returning to Carlisle and recommitting to the vegetarian lifestyle that had become his identity and his moral foundation. He returned to school and to Forks with careful planning about how he would sit next to Bella in biology class while maintaining discipline. His strategy involving holding his breath for the entire period and involving maintaining maximum possible distance from her within the constraints of sharing lab table, and involving focusing all his attention on not killing her rather than in actually learning anything or on actually engaging with the class material that was merely excuse for the real challenge of existing in close proximity to human whose blood promised pleasure beyond any Edward had ever imagined. His behavior toward Bella during the following weeks was deliberately rude and was deliberately cold. His attempts to create distance and to discourage her interest in him backfiring as his hostility apparently made him more intriguing rather than less intriguing to the girl whose thoughts he could not read and whose reactions he could not predict with the certainty that telepathy usually provided when dealing with humans, whose internal responses were visible to him before their external behaviors revealed what they were thinking or feeling. He sat next to her in biology class, holding his breath and gripping the table edge and carefully not looking at her, while simultaneously being hyper-aware of her every movement and her every breath and her every shift in position that changed the air currents and changed the concentration of her scent in ways that made some moments more bearable and made some moments nearly impossible to endure without attacking her. He read the thoughts of the other students who were forming opinions about Bella and forming attractions to Bella. Mike Newton's infatuation and Jessica Stanley's jealous observations, and Eric Yorkie's awkward interest giving Edward information about how Bella appeared to others, even though her own thoughts remained hidden behind whatever shield her mind possessed that kept Edward from accessing the interior perspective that he desperately wanted to understand, so that he could predict her behavior and could protect her from himself through greater knowledge of what she was thinking and what she was planning, and whether she had noticed his bizarre behavior, and whether she was correctly interpreting his rudeness as desperate attempt at self-preservation rather than as genuine dislike. March brought the van accident in the school parking lot when Tyler Crowley lost control of his vehicle on the ice, and when the van came sliding toward Bella with force and trajectory that would have crushed her against her truck and would have killed her instantly if Edward had not made split-second decision to intervene, despite the exposure risk and despite the revelation of his supernatural speed and strength that saving her would necessarily entail. The decision happened without conscious thought, his body moving before his mind could analyze the consequences or could weigh the family's safety against Bella's life. His hands stopping the van with force that left dent in the metal that human strength could not have created, and that Bella witnessed from close enough distance that denial was impossible even if she wanted to pretend that what she had seen was normal human capability enhanced by adrenaline, rather than supernatural intervention that revealed Edward as something other than the human student he pretended to be. The hospital aftermath involved Carlyle treating Bella for minor injuries, while Edward watched from nearby, and while Bella asked questions about how Edward had reached her in time to stop the van, and about how he had possessed the strength to prevent the vehicle from crushing her. Her inquiries making Edward realize that she was not going to accept easy lies or comfortable explanations that would allow her to maintain the fiction that he was simply unusually strong human, rather than something else entirely that her mind was systematically working to identify through observation and through the deductive reasoning that her intelligence apparently supported, even when her thoughts remained completely hidden from Edward's desperate attempts to understand what conclusions she was drawing from the evidence his rescue had provided. The stalking behavior that Edward engaged in after the van incident represented his rationalization that he was protecting Bella from dangers that existed beyond himself. His nightly visits to her bedroom window to watch her sleep, initially motivated by curiosity about what she dreamed and what she said in her sleep that might reveal the thoughts her waking mind kept hidden behind the shield that his telepathy could not penetrate. He justified the invasion of her privacy through the logic that he needed to understand her better to protect her more effectively, his reasoning conveniently ignoring that the primary danger to Bella's safety came from himself and his barely controlled thirst, rather than from external threats that required his vigilant observation of her sleeping form night after night, as he sat in the rocking chair in her bedroom, listening to her breathe and listening to her unconscious murmurs that sometimes included his name in ways that suggested she was thinking about him even in sleep. He followed her everywhere during the day as well, his presence nearby when she went to Port Angeles with Jessica Stanley and Angela Weber, ostensibly to shop for prom dresses, but actually to give Edward opportunity to demonstrate his protective capabilities. When drunk men approached Bella in dark street with intentions that Edward read clearly from their vile thoughts that made killing them seem not just justified, but necessary to protect Bella and to protect future victims from men whose plans involved violence and violation, that Edward prevented by appearing suddenly and by radiating enough menace that the would-be attackers fled, rather than confronting the pale, beautiful young man, whose appearance was deceptively gentle, but whose presence carried weight that humans instinctively recognized as dangerous, even when they could not articulate why this particular teenager made their survival instincts scream warnings about predators and about threats that exceeded normal human dangers, that they understood through experience and through the cultural frameworks that prepared them for human violence, but that left them completely unprepared for supernatural predator who could kill them all without visible effort and without leaving evidence that conventional forensics could interpret. The drive to Port Angeles restaurant happened with Bella in Edward's car after he had rescued her from the situation that his stalking had allowed him to anticipate and to prevent. Their first real conversation unfolding during the drive and during the meal, where Bella ate human food while Edward pretended to eat and instead spent the time watching her and listening to her speak and trying to understand through her words what her closed mind refused to reveal through the direct access that his telepathy provided with every other human he encountered, whose thoughts were as visible to him as their physical actions, and whose internal lives held no secrets. Once Edward had spent even brief time in their presence, reading the constant stream of consciousness that humans broadcast without knowing they were being overheard by monster sitting across from them pretending to be interested in conversation, while actually cataloguing every verbal cue and every behavioral pattern that might provide insight into the mystery of Bella Swan's silent mind. The frustration of her silence was acute and was constant. Every question he asked designed partly to gather information he actually wanted, but designed primarily to try to understand how she thought and how her mind worked when he could not simply read the answers directly from her consciousness, the way he could read answers from every other person whose thoughts broadcast continuously into the telepathic space that only Edward could perceive, and that only Edward could navigate with the ease of long practice that had made human psychology familiar to him in ways that exceeded what even the most empathetic human could achieve through observation and conversation alone. Her perceptiveness troubled him even as it fascinated him. Her observations about his behavior and her questions about what he was revealing, that she had noticed details that most humans would have missed, and that she was actively trying to understand, rather than simply accepting his carefully constructed facade of normalcy that had fooled every other human who had encountered him across his decades of living among humanity without forming attachments or forming connections that would complicate the careful performance that allowed the Cullens to exist in human society without drawing attention. She asked questions that came too close to truth. Her inquiries about how he had reached her in time to stop the van, and about how he had possessed the strength to prevent the vehicle from crushing her, making Edward realize that she was not going to accept easy lies or comfortable explanations that would allow her to maintain the fiction that he was simply unusually strong human, rather than something else entirely, that her mind was systematically working to identify through observation and through the deductive reasoning that her intelligence supported even when operating without the advantage of telepathy or precognition or any of the supernatural gifts that made information gathering easier for vampires than for humans who had to rely on limited senses and limited cognitive processing. The growing obsession consumed Edward completely during the weeks following the Port Angeles incident, his thoughts returning constantly to Bella and to the mystery she represented, and to the novelty of experiencing genuine uncertainty about what someone was thinking when his entire existence since transformation had been characterized by perfect knowledge of everyone's internal states and everyone's hidden motivations that telepathy revealed with clarity that made human social interactions simultaneously easier and more boring than it would have been without his gift that eliminated surprise and eliminated the kind of gradual discovery that made human relationships develop through stages of increasing intimacy and increasing knowledge, rather than through immediate total access to everything the person thought and felt and remembered about their entire existence. Bella was the first person in decades who could surprise him, her words and her actions emerging from thoughts he could not predict or anticipate, her presence creating the kind of engaged attention that Edward had not felt since his human life, when other people's minds had been mysteries that required conversation and observation to begin understanding, rather than open books that revealed everything immediately upon upon first mental contact. His family observed his preoccupation with amusement and with concern that varied among the different members according to their personalities and their own experiences with human-vampire relationships that range from non-existent to cautiously managed across the decades of their various existences. Emmett teased him relentlessly about finally finding a girl who interested him after decades of refusing every opportunity for romance that vampire society or human proximity had offered. His jokes about Edward's obvious infatuation, making family dinners uncomfortable, and making Edward wish that he could simply avoid the house entirely, rather than enduring the commentary and the observations that his siblings felt entitled to make about his internal state and his changed behavior that apparently was obvious to everyone, even without telepathy to confirm what his actions and his distraction clearly indicated to vampires who had known him long enough to recognize when his carefully maintained emotional distance was crumbling in the face of human girl, whose appeal transcended rational explanation. Alice watched with knowing looks that suggested her visions had shown her futures that she was carefully not discussing with Edward to avoid influencing his decisions, or to avoid revealing outcomes that needed to unfold naturally without precognitive interference that might alter the timeline in ways that would create different futures than the ones Alice had already seen, and that she apparently believed were preferable to the alternatives that other choices might create. Rosalie's disgust was predictable and was vocal. Her position that Edward was risking the family's safety and was risking exposure for human girl, representing legitimate concern mixed with jealousy that Edward had never shown Rosalie herself, the kind of intense interest that he was now showing to ordinary human, whose only remarkable quality was apparently her silent mind and her appealing blood that called to Edward with intensity that made objectivity impossible and made a rational assessment of the situation beyond his current capabilities. Bella's research into local legends led her to the Twilight stories about the Cold Ones, her conversation with Jacob Black at La Push Beach, providing her with enough information that Edward knew through reading Mike Newton's thoughts about the beach trip, that she had gathered pieces of truth that she was assembling into accurate understanding of what Edward was, even though she had not yet confronted him directly with her conclusions or her theories about his nature that were apparently forming through combination of observation and research and deductive reasoning that was leading her systematically toward comprehension of what he was and what his family was and what their presence in Forks meant for her safety and for her future. The realization that she knew or suspected came as relief, mixed with terror. Edward's desire to be known by someone warring with his fear that being known would destroy whatever nascent relationship was developing between them, and would make her flee from him the way any sensible human should flee from vampire, whose control was questionable and whose desire for her blood remained constant undercurrent beneath every interaction and every moment they spent together in biology class or anywhere else, where her scent reminded him that he was predator and she was prey regardless of whatever romantic feelings were complicating that fundamental relationship. The biology field trip to the greenhouse provided opportunity for their verbal sparring to intensify as they worked together on assignment that neither of them needed to focus on, given that Edward had completed similar assignments dozens of times across his various high school attendances, and given that Bella's intelligence made the simple classification task easy enough that she could complete it while simultaneously engaging in the careful dance of questions and answers that constituted their conversations, where every word carried multiple meanings and where every exchange was simultaneously about the surface topic and about the deeper questions of what Edward was, and whether Bella was afraid, and whether fear was appropriate response to discovering that the beautiful boy she was attracted to was actually monster whose nature made him dangerous in ways that normal teenage boys could never approach, regardless of how badly they might want to hurt someone or how violent their worst impulses might be, when compared to the casual lethal capability that Edward possessed, and that he exercised constant discipline to restrain in her presence. Edward watched her face during these conversations, trying to read in her expressions what her mind refused to reveal through telepathy. His study of micro-expressions and body language, inadequate substitute for the direct access he craved, but better than nothing, when nothing was the alternative to careful observation and careful interpretation of physical cues that humans leaked constantly, but that required attention and skill to decode accurately without the advantage of telepathic confirmation of what the observed behaviors actually meant in terms of internal emotional states and cognitive processes. His decision to pursue friendship, despite the dangers, represented surrender to feelings that he had tried to resist and tried to rationalize away as simple curiosity or simple novelty, rather than as genuine emotional attachment that was developing despite his better judgment and despite his certainty that loving Bella would inevitably lead to tragedy when his nature and her mortality made long-term relationship impossible and made the most likely endings either her death through his loss of control or her transformation into vampire who would blame him forever for stealing her humanity and her soul that Edward believed transformation would destroy or would corrupt beyond redemption. He admitted what he was in the woods after school on day when they had driven separately in vehicles that allowed private conversation away from the constant observation and constant gossip that characterized the small school where everyone noticed everything and where Edward and Bella's increasingly obvious connection was becoming topic of speculation and rumor among students who had initially expected Edward to remain aloof and unattached the way he had been since arriving in Forks months earlier, without showing interest in any of the girls who had pursued his attention, with varying degrees of subtlety and varying degrees of desperation that Edward had deflected without difficulty, because none of them had possessed Bella's silent mind, or Bella's perceptiveness, or Bella's apparent immunity to the supernatural attraction that vampires supposedly exerted over humans who found them beautiful and compelling in ways that transcended normal physical attractiveness. The meadow became their sanctuary when Edward took Bella there to show her his skin in sunlight. The demonstration of how vampires sparkled rather than burning, revealing both his beauty and his monstrousness in ways that words could never capture, and that made denial impossible for Bella, who could see with her own eyes that Edward was not human and was not anything that existed in normal world governed by normal rules about what was possible and what was real, and what kinds of creatures walked among humans pretending to be teenagers attending high school and pretending to care about grades and social hierarchies and all the mundane concerns that occupied human consciousness. He stood in the sunny clearing, letting light hit his exposed skin and watching Bella's face for reaction that would tell him whether she was horrified or whether she could accept what he was, despite the evidence that he was creature of nightmare, rather than the romantic figure that some part of her apparently wanted him to be, based on her continued presence and her continued willingness to be alone with him in isolated locations, where he could easily kill her and dispose of her body without witnesses or without evidence that would lead investigators to vampire, rather than to more conventional explanations for disappearance. The depth of his thirst for her blood warred constantly with the love that was emerging, despite his attempts to prevent emotional attachment that would make inevitable separation more painful for both of them when circumstances finally forced them apart through his loss of control or through external intervention from his family or from simple recognition that their relationship was unsustainable and was dangerous beyond what either of them should be willing to accept for sake of romance that had no future and no possibility of happy ending, according to every rational analysis that Edward could perform when he managed to think clearly, rather than simply responding to the overwhelming desire to be near her despite the danger and despite the constant temptation. He told her explicitly about the danger she was in from him, his honesty about wanting to kill her, and about the constant burning thirst that her scent created, meant to frighten her away and meant to make her understand that whatever attraction existed between them was fundamentally unsafe and fundamentally wrong, according to every reasonable standard that should govern interactions between predator and prey, who were pretending to be something else and who were ignoring the biological imperatives that made their relationship dangerous and made Edward's every moment with her an exercise in control that could fail at any instant if his discipline wavered or if circumstances conspired to weaken his resolve. Her response of not being afraid or of claiming not to be afraid frustrated him and fascinated him in equal measure. Her courage or her stupidity, making it impossible for him to maintain the distance that safety required, and making it impossible for him to resist the pull toward greater intimacy and greater emotional investment in relationship that his rational mind knew was doomed, but that his heart refused to abandon, despite the warnings and despite the certain knowledge that loving Bella Swan was the most selfish thing he had done since his rebellious decade when he had killed humans for his own satisfaction, rather than denying his nature the way Carlyle's example had taught him to do. The lion and the lamb metaphor that emerged from their conversation captured the absurdity and the tragedy of their situation perfectly. Edward's self-identification as sick, masochistic lion, acknowledging that pursuing Bella, despite wanting to kill her, represented fundamental corruption of whatever remained of his humanity or his morality after decades of struggling to maintain values that vampire nature actively resisted and actively undermined through instincts that made killing feel natural and made restraint feel like fighting against every impulse that transformation had embedded in his reconstructed body. Meeting Charlie Swan was awkward theatre, where Edward played the polite boyfriend, while reading Charlie's protective thoughts about Bella and Charlie's suspicions about Edward's intentions and Charlie's general discomfort with his teenage daughter dating anyone, but especially dating boy, who looked like Edward and who carried himself with confidence that Charlie found simultaneously impressive and threatening in ways he could not articulate, but that his thoughts revealed clearly to Edward, who understood that Charlie's instincts about danger were correct, even if Charlie could never guess, the specific nature of the threat that Edward represented to his daughter's safety and to her future, and to her very life that hung in balance every moment she spent with Vampire, whose control was tested constantly by her presence, and whose thirst remained ever-present reality, beneath the carefully maintained facade of devoted boyfriend, interested in normal relationship, rather than in satisfying craving that animal blood could never adequately address. The baseball game that followed weeks later, when Thunderstorm provided cover for the noise of vampires playing America's pastime, with supernatural strength and supernatural speed, represented a moment of happiness and normalcy that shattered when Alice experienced vision of 3 nomadic vampires approaching their location, drawn by curiosity about the game and about the coven, playing it with enthusiasm that made the sound of bat hitting ball echo like thunder across the clearing where they had gathered for rare family activity that included Bella as witness to their true natures and their true capabilities. James caught Bella's scent the moment the wind shifted during the baseball game, the tracker's entire demeanor transforming instantly from casual curiosity about the Cullen Coven to focused predatory intensity that Edward recognized immediately through reading James's thoughts, that went from mild interest in meeting other vampires to absolute fixation on the human girl, whose scent apparently triggered the hunting instinct that defined James's existence and that made him legendary among nomadic vampires who knew his reputation for never abandoning prey once he had committed to pursuit, regardless of obstacles or regardless of danger that pursuing might entail, or regardless of opposition from other vampires who might try to protect his chosen target. The shift in James's thoughts was immediate and was total, his consciousness narrowing to single purpose of hunting Bella, with a kind of obsessive focus that made him dangerous beyond what his physical capabilities alone would suggest, and that made him nearly impossible to discourage or to distract once he had decided that particular prey was worth pursuing, regardless of obstacles or regardless of opposition from other vampires who might try to protect his chosen target from the hunt that James viewed as entertainment and as validation of his skills, and as fundamental expression of his nature as tracker, whose gifts made him exceptionally effective at finding prey, who tried to hide or tried to flee from predator, who could follow their scent across continents and across weeks or months if necessary to complete hunt, once it had begun, and once he had committed his considerable abilities to the pursuit that would end only with the prey's death, or with James's own destruction at the hands of vampires powerful enough to stop him. Edward's realization of his catastrophic mistake hit him with force that made breathing difficult, despite not needing to breathe. His recognition that bringing Bella into his world and bringing her into proximity with other vampires had marked her for death by the most dangerous tracker in North America, making everything that had seemed romantic or seemed worthwhile about their relationship suddenly appear as monstrous selfishness that had prioritized Edward's desires over Bella's safety in ways that he could not rationalize or could not excuse through any framework except acknowledging that he had been willing to risk her life for the pleasure of her company and for the novelty of her silent mind that had fascinated him enough to override every reasonable precaution that should have kept them apart, and should have kept her ignorant of vampire existence, and should have kept her safely living her human life without the complications and the dangers that knowing Edward had introduced into her previously ordinary existence. The family's rapid departure from the baseball field happened with choreographed precision as the Cullens split up to confuse James and to protect Bella through misdirection that might buy them time to find James and to kill him before he could get close enough to Bella to make his superior tracking abilities decisive advantage that would allow him to find her regardless of where they hid her or how carefully they obscured her trail through false leads and through strategic movements that Alice's precognition suggested might delay James, but that Edward knew through reading James's thoughts would only provide temporary respite before the tracker adapted his strategy and overcame whatever obstacles they placed between him and his chosen prey. Edward took Bella south toward Phoenix with Alice and Jasper as guards. The decision to take her to familiar territory representing strategic choice, based on the theory that Bella would be more comfortable in cities she knew, and that the large population would provide cover, and would make James's hunting more difficult in urban environment where vampires needed to maintain secrecy, and where obvious pursuit would risk exposure that even tracker as skilled as James would want to avoid, given that Volturi law about maintaining vampire secrecy applied to everyone, regardless of how inconvenient that law might be when interfering with hunts. Carlisle and Emmett and Rosalie and Esme remained in Forks to hunt James directly, their plan involving luring the tracker into confrontation, where superior numbers would allow them to destroy him before he could reach Bella, or before he could adapt his strategy to account for the Cullen family's defensive measures that they were implementing with increasing urgency, as James's thoughts revealed his systematic working through their deception and his systematic narrowing of possible locations where Bella might be hiding. Edward listened through Carlisle's mind to the updates about James's movements and about the tracker's uncanny ability to see through misdirection that should have confused him, but that instead seemed only to sharpen his focus and to intensify his determination to complete hunt that had become personal and had become test of his abilities against Coven, that was attempting to deny him prey he had claimed as his through the fundamental predator right of first scent and first commitment to pursuit. Edward's desperation during the drive south, and during the days hiding in Phoenix Hotel, manifested as hypervigilance that made rest impossible and made rational planning difficult. When every moment brought fresh terror about James getting past the family's defenses and getting close enough to Bella to make rescue impossible, or to make rescue too late to save her from death, that Edward's selfishness had made inevitable through his refusal to stay away from her when staying away would have kept her invisible to nomadic vampires whose paths would never have crossed hers if Edward had maintained the discipline and the boundaries that should have governed his interactions with fragile human, whose mortality made her unsuitable companion for vampire, whose very existence put everyone around him at risk. He listened constantly through Alice's thoughts for visions of James's location and James's plans, the precognitive updates providing some tactical advantage, but also revealing James's systematic elimination of the Cullen family's defensive strategies and James's frighteningly effective adaptation to their attempts to track him, while he was simultaneously tracking Bella with skills that exceeded what Edward had anticipated, and that made the protection plan seem increasingly inadequate. As hours passed, and as James got closer to finding Bella, despite the family's best efforts to prevent him from acquiring the information he needed, James's phone call to Bella represented the culmination of his strategy and represented the psychological manipulation that supplemented his physical tracking abilities. His video recording of Bella's mother Renee apparently captured in Bella's childhood home, creating illusion that James held Renee hostage and creating a situation where Bella's protective instincts toward her mother would override her survival instincts and would make her willing to sacrifice herself to save Renee from violence that James had no intention of actually perpetrating, but that the video suggested was imminent unless Bella complied with James's instructions to come alone to the ballet studio, where she had taken lessons as child, and where James had researched enough about her history to know that sentimental location would seem plausible as meeting place. Edward heard Bella's resolve to go to James, crystallizing in her determination. He could read in her body language and could read in her careful planning about how to escape from Alice and Jasper's supervision. His inability to read her thoughts, making it impossible to prevent her departure until she had already left the hotel and had already made her way to the ballet studio where James was waiting with video equipment to record the hunt and the kill that he intended to use as message to Edward about the consequences of interfering with Tracker's chosen prey. The race to the ballet studio consumed minutes that felt like hours as Edward drove at speeds that risked exposure and risked accidents, but that were necessary if he was going to reach Bella before James killed her, or before James's venom reached her heart and began the transformation that would save her life but would also steal her humanity and would make her vampire against her will and against Edward's desperate desire to preserve her human existence and her human future. That transformation would permanently eliminate, along with her soul that Edward believed would be lost or would be corrupted in ways that would make her regret transformation once she understood what she had become. He arrived to find Bella broken and bleeding on the ballet studio floor. James's attack having been brutal and having been efficient in ways that demonstrated his combat experience and his complete lack of mercy toward prey, who had proven more interesting than most, but who were ultimately just another human, whose death would provide momentary entertainment before James moved on to next hunt and next prey, who would capture his attention. The impossible decision confronted Edward immediately upon seeing the wound on Bella's wrist where James had bitten her. The venom already spreading through her bloodstream and already beginning the transformation that would kill her as human and would rebirth her as vampire unless Edward could extract the venom before it reached her heart and before the transformation became irreversible through the biological processes that vampire venom triggered in human bodies that were being systematically rewritten and systematically reconstructed into immortal forms that would preserve consciousness but would eliminate humanity along with mortality and along with whatever qualities made humans fundamentally different from vampires. Bella's whispered plea for transformation cut through his panic and cut through his desperate attempts to assess the medical situation. Her request that he change her, rather than letting her die, revealing that she wanted vampire existence and wanted eternity with him even at cost of her humanity and her soul, that Edward believed transformation would destroy or would corrupt beyond redemption. His refusal was immediate and absolute. His conviction that vampires were damned and were soulless, making the idea of transforming Bella unthinkable, regardless of whether transformation was the medically simpler solution. compared to attempting to suck venom from her wound while controlling his thirst sufficiently to avoid draining her completely and killing her through the same mechanism that was supposed to save her from James's venom, that was spreading through her system with every heartbeat that pumped it further through her body and closer to her heart, where it would complete its work and would begin the 3-day transformation process that would end with Bella waking as vampire with red eyes and with thirst that would make her dangerous to every human in Phoenix. Carlisle's arrival with the rest of the family provided medical expertise and provided backup if Edward's control failed during the attempt to extract venom from Bella's bloodstream before transformation completed. The older vampire's calm assessment of the situation and calm instructions to Edward about what needed to happen, giving Edward framework to focus on, rather than simply panicking about the multiplying ways this situation could end with Bella's death, or Bella's transformation against both their wishes, or at least against Edward's wishes, given that Bella had explicitly requested transformation and had explicitly indicated her preference for vampire existence over death, despite Edward's certainty that she did not understand what she was asking for. Sucking the venom from Bella's wrist was simultaneously ecstasy and agony. The taste of her blood exceeding every fantasy and exceeding every imagined pleasure that Edward had constructed during months of wanting to taste her, and months of restraining himself from the feeding that would have satisfied his thirst, but would have ended her life and would have made him murderer rather than protector. The blood sang to him the way her scent sang to him, the consumption triggering every pleasure center and every satisfaction mechanism that vampire physiology possessed, while simultaneously requiring superhuman control to stop drinking before he had drained her completely, and before the pleasure of feeding overcame the love that made stopping possible, despite every instinct screaming at him to continue, until the blood was gone, and until the thirst was satisfied in ways that animal blood could never satisfy, despite decades of vegetarian lifestyle. The venom extraction required him to swallow her blood while searching for the foreign venom that James had introduced. The complexity of the task, making it difficult beyond anything Edward had attempted, and making success uncertain even with Carlisle's guidance about what the venom would taste like mixed with Bella's blood, and about how to identify when extraction was complete, versus when more venom remained in her system, requiring continued sucking, that brought Edward closer to losing control with every swallow. Carlisle's command to stop penetrated Edward's feeding trance when Bella's heart rate dropped dangerously low, the older vampire's voice carrying authority that Edward's conscious mind could barely process through the overwhelming sensory experience of finally tasting the blood he had craved since January, when Bella had first walked into biology class and had first triggered the obsessive thirst that had defined their entire relationship and had made every moment together feel like test of control. The struggle to pull away from her wrist required every bit of discipline he had accumulated across decades of vegetarian lifestyle and required Carlisle's physical intervention, pulling Edward away from Bella when his own will proved insufficient to overcome the biological imperatives that made stopping feel like dying and made continuing feel like the only thing that mattered. The family's killing of James happened simultaneously in the studio's back room, where Emmett and Jasper dismembered the tracker's body with efficient violence that ended the threat and that ended James's existence with the kind of permanent finality that vampire deaths required through complete destruction that prevented any possibility of regeneration or survival. Alice built fire to burn the pieces, the flames consuming James's remains and eliminating the evidence of vampire combat that might otherwise have left traces that human investigators could find and could puzzle over in ways that might lead to uncomfortable questions. Victoria's escape during the confusion represented future threat that Edward barely registered in the moment when Bella's survival consumed all his attention. The hospital recovery period involved Bella's physical healing and involved Edward's psychological torment about having failed to protect her and having caused her injuries through his selfish desire to involve her in his world. Despite knowing the dangers that his presence created, and despite understanding that loving her meant endangering her in ways that would inevitably lead to situations like this one, where she was broken and bleeding because Edward had been too weak to stay away from her, when staying away would have kept her safe from trackers and safe from violence and safe from everything except the normal human dangers that her mortal existence would naturally encounter. His guilt manifested as renewed conviction that he should leave her and should let her return to normal human life without vampire boyfriend whose presence attracted danger and whose love seemed to bring only suffering despite his intentions and despite his attempts to protect her from threats that his very existence created. Bella's insistence that she wanted to stay with him despite everything undermined Edward's attempts to do the right thing by leaving her. Her stubborn refusal to accept his protection in the form of absence, making it impossible for him to walk away the way he knew he should for her safety and for her future and for her chance at normal human life that his presence was systematically destroying through the accumulated dangers and the accumulated traumas that knowing him had introduced into her previously ordinary existence. The prom became their attempt at normal teenage experience despite nothing about their relationship being normal. Edward taking her, wanting to give her human experiences before the transformation that seemed increasingly inevitable despite his continued resistance to the idea of condemning her to vampire existence that he still believed represented damnation rather than salvation, regardless of what she claimed to want, or what she believed about the desirability of immortality with him. Summer of 2005 brought comfortable period in their renewed relationship, as Edward and Bella settled into routines that felt sustainable and felt manageable despite the underlying knowledge that transformation loomed in their future, and that the human phase of their relationship had defined endpoint, whether that endpoint came through Edward's transformation of Bella or through some other family member performing transformation. If Edward continued to resist despite his agreement in principle that transformation was inevitable, given the Volturi's ultimatum, and given Bella's own persistent desire for immortality that transcended Edward's objections and his concerns about condemning her to existence, he still viewed as damnation, regardless of the decades he had spent proving that vampires could choose compassion over predation and could maintain values that their nature actively resisted. Edward's nightly presence in Bella's room, watching her sleep and talking with her until dawn, resumed as though the separation had never happened, and as though the Italy crisis had not revealed the depths of his capacity for self-destruction when he believed she was dead. His inability to stay away from her, now accepted as permanent feature of their relationship rather than as temporary weakness, that he should overcome through discipline or through commitment to protecting her through distance that had proven ineffective and had proven more dangerous than his presence, given that her cliff jumping and her depression during his absence had nearly killed her more effectively than his thirst had ever threatened. Charlie's rules about Edward not being allowed in the house represented futile attempt at parental control that both Edward and Bella cheerfully ignored. Edward's ability to enter through window making Charlie's restriction on front door access meaningless, except a symbol of Charlie's disapproval and Charlie's concern about his teenage daughter's relationship with Boy, who had previously abandoned her and who might abandon her again if circumstances made staying seem too dangerous or too complicated for the mysterious Cullen family, whose wealth and whose beauty and whose strange behaviors made them subject of speculation and mild suspicion among Forks residents, who could not quite articulate what made the Cullens different, but who sensed that something about them did not fit normal patterns of human family life. Edward read Charlie's thoughts during the awkward dinners when he was permitted to visit through the front door under Charlie's supervision. The police chief's protective instincts and his cop's intuition, making him wary of Edward in ways that were entirely justified, even if Charlie could never guess the specific nature of the threat that Edward represented to his daughter's safety and to her future, and to her very existence, that hung in balance every moment she spent with Vampire, whose control had improved with familiarity, but who still experienced constant low-level thirst. Whenever Bella's scent reminded him that he was Predator sitting across the dinner table from Prey, who trusted him completely and who had no real understanding of how much discipline Edward exercised every moment to maintain the facade of safe boyfriend rather than revealing the monster beneath. The Jacob Black problem emerged as source of tension and source of jealousy that Edward had not experienced before, given that his telepathy usually allowed him to assess potential rivals and to dismiss them as non-threats based on reading their thoughts and understanding their limitations, and understanding that no human boy could compete with Vampire's supernatural appeal, or with the intensity of connection that Edward and Bella had forged through shared dangers and shared secrets that isolated them from normal teenage relationships. Jacob represented genuine threat in Edward's perception, because Jacob loved Bella genuinely, and because Jacob offered alternative future that included warmth and included humanity, and included the possibility of normal life with normal aging and normal children, that Edward could never give Bella, no matter how much he loved her, or how much he wanted to provide everything she desired from relationship that was fundamentally limited by his vampire nature and by the biological impossibilities that transformation had created when it had frozen his body in unchanging state that could not age and could not reproduce and could not participate in the normal human life cycle that Bella would experience if she chose Jacob over Edward, and if she chose humanity over immortality. Reading Jacob's thoughts revealed the depth of Jacob's feelings and revealed Jacob's hope that Bella would eventually choose him over Edward. Once she recognized that Jacob could offer her future that Edward's vampire nature made impossible, the werewolf's confidence in his own appeal and his confidence that Bella's attraction to Edward was based partly on supernatural allure rather than on genuine compatibility, creating resentment in Edward, who wanted to believe that Bella's love for him was authentic rather than being influenced by vampire qualities that humans found attractive without understanding why, or without being able to resist the pull toward creatures who were designed by nature or by transformation to be apex predators capable of luring prey through beauty and through charm, that made killing easier when victims came willingly rather than requiring pursuit. The treaty with the Quileute werewolves that prevented Cold Ones from entering Quileute land created practical barrier that prevented Edward from following Bella when she visited Jacob on the reservation. His frustration at being unable to monitor her safety and unable to read Jacob's thoughts when they were together, making him anxious in ways that he recognized were possessive, but that he could not fully overcome, despite recognizing that Bella deserved freedom to maintain friendships without Edward's constant supervision and without his telepathic monitoring of everyone she interacted with when he was present to read their thoughts and their intentions. The marriage discussion that had been ongoing since their return from Italy intensified during the summer months as Edward pressed his conditions for agreeing to transform Bella, and as Bella continued to resist the idea of marriage that her modern sensibilities made seem unnecessary or seem like outdated institution that contemporary couples could forego without social consequences or without the moral implications that Edward's 1918 upbringing associated with unmarried intimacy and with the kind of permanent commitment that transformation would create between them, regardless of whether legal marriage preceded the biological bond that vampire mates formed through mechanisms that Edward did not fully understand, but that he had observed in Carlyle and Esme, and in Rosalie and Emmett, and in Alice and Jasper, whose relationships seemed to transcend normal human attachment, and seemed to create connections that were unbreakable and were eternal in ways that human marriages with their divorce rates and their impermanence could never achieve. Edward's perspective on marriage came from entirely different cultural contexts, where divorce was scandalous, and where marriage represented sacred commitment that couples entered with expectation of permanence, rather than with backup plans for dissolution if relationship proved unsatisfying or proved incompatible once the initial romance faded and once the practical realities of sharing lives became apparent through daily interaction and through the inevitable conflicts that arose when two people tried to merge their separate existences into unified partnership. Bella's resistance to marriage stemmed partly from her parents' failed marriage that had shaped her understanding of matrimony as institution that often ended in divorce and often caused more pain than it prevented. Her observation of Charlie and Renee's incompatibility and their subsequent decades of living separately having taught her that marriage promises were easily broken and that legal contracts did not ensure emotional commitment or ensure lasting happiness in ways that would justify the formal ceremony and the public declaration and all the social expectations that came with traditional wedding. The negotiation between their different values and their different cultural backgrounds regarding marriage represented broader negotiation about how vampire and human would merge their lives when vampire carried values from early 20th century and human carried values from early 21st century that differed fundamentally about gender roles and about institutional commitments and about whether traditions mattered or whether modern pragmatism should govern their choices about how to structure their relationship and how to formalize their commitment in ways that satisfied both Edward's need for traditional validation and Bella's desire to avoid what she perceived as unnecessary formality that had failed to protect her parents' relationship, and that seemed unlikely to add anything meaningful to the connection she already felt with Edward. September 13th of 2005 marked Bella's 18th birthday, the date arriving with significance that Edward felt acutely as he watched the girl he loved cross the threshold into legal adulthood, while he remained frozen eternally at 17 years old in the body that transformation had preserved in 1918, when Spanish influenza had killed his human self, and when Carlyle's venom had created the immortal version who now faced the uncomfortable reality that his girlfriend was aging while he was not, and that the physical and social gap between them would only widen with each passing year until the situation became unsustainable or became obviously inappropriate in ways that their current 1-year age difference allowed them to ignore or to minimize. His anxiety about Bella's aging had been growing throughout the summer months as her 18th birthday approached. His awareness that she was moving forward through normal human life stages while he remained perpetually adolescent, making him question whether their relationship had any real future, or whether they were simply delaying inevitable separation that would come either through Bella's transformation that Edward still resisted performing, or through Bella's natural aging that would eventually make their relationship impossible to maintain without drawing attention. The party at the Cullen house was Alice's creation, despite Edward's objections, and despite Bella's expressed preference for quiet birthday without elaborate celebration. Alice's enthusiasm for parties and her genuine affection for Bella, overriding both their resistances to the idea of gathering that would highlight Bella's humanity and would highlight her vulnerability in a house full of vampires whose control varied and whose thirst for her blood remained constant factor even after months of exposure, had theoretically made them accustomed to her scent, though Edward knew from reading their thoughts that accustomed did not mean immune, and that Bella's presence still created temptation for family members whose discipline was less developed than Edward's own hard-won control. Edward's reluctance about the party stemmed partly from concern about safety and partly from his growing conviction that celebrating Bella's birthday meant celebrating her mortality and celebrating the passing time that separated them increasingly with each day that she aged and each day that he did not age in body that would be 17 forever. Alice had decorated the Cullen house with elaborate streamers and with elaborate flower arrangements and with all the ceremonial excess that birthday parties for humans typically involved. Her vision of perfect celebration apparently requiring aesthetic presentation that Edward found excessive and found somewhat tone-deaf, given that Bella's discomfort with attention and Bella's discomfort with being celebrated made the elaborate party seem more about Alice's desires than about Bella's actual preferences. The wrapped presents were arranged carefully on a table near the piano. Alice's selection of gifts for Bella, representing combination of genuine thoughtfulness and gentle pressure toward accepting vampire lifestyle and accepting transformation that Alice's visions had shown would eventually happen despite Edward's current resistance. Bella's paper cut, while opening presents, happened with the kind of casual accident that characterized human fragility. The single drop of blood that welled from the small cut on Bella's finger was insignificant by human standards, but was devastating by vampire standards. The scent of fresh blood in enclosed space, full of vampires whose control was being tested, triggering immediate responses in multiple family members whose eyes darkened and whose bodies tense with the instinctive preparation for feeding that blood scent activated. Jasper's attack was instantaneous and was driven by instinct that overwhelmed his conscious mind and his empathic gift that normally helped him maintain control. His newness to the vegetarian lifestyle compared to the other family members, making his control more fragile and making his thirst more volatile. His decades of feeding on humans during the Southern Vampire Wars, having created patterns that 8 years of animal blood had not fully overridden. Edward's response was protective but was poorly calibrated in the panic of the moment. His decision to throw Bella across the room to get her away from Jasper, resulting in her impact with the table that held glass plates and glass decorations that shattered when she crashed into them, and that cut her arms and her back with additional injuries that made the blood situation worse rather than better, and that created multiple bleeding wounds instead of single paper cut. The sound of shattering glass and the sight of Bella bleeding from multiple cuts, while Jasper fought against Emmett, and Carlisle's restraining holds created chaos in the carefully controlled household, where vampire nature and human morality coexisted uneasily. Carlisle's medical attention to Bella's injuries happened in his study, where the smell of blood was somewhat contained, and where Jasper's continued presence downstairs would not interfere with the treatment that required Carlisle to handle Bella's bleeding wounds while maintaining perfect control despite the temptation. Edward watched Carlisle stitch Bella's arm with efficient movements that betrayed no hint of struggle. The older vampire's calm competence demonstrating the vast gulf between Carlisle's centuries of discipline and the younger vampire's more fragile commitments to vegetarian lifestyle. The family discussion that Edward overheard after Carlisle had finished treating Bella's injuries revealed the fault lines that the birthday disaster had exposed among family members whose commitment to keeping Bella safe varied based on their individual relationships with her. Rosalie's vindication was obvious in her thoughts. Her position that involving Bella had always been mistake-receiving support from the evening's events. Jasper's shame was profound and was complicated by Alice's distress. His thoughts revealing his consideration of leaving the family to protect them from his inadequate control. Edward's decision to leave Bella emerged from the birthday disaster, but had been developing throughout the summer as he watched her age and as he contemplated the impossibility of their long-term future together. His conviction that she would be safer without him and would be happier without him, based partly on rational assessment of dangers that his presence in her life created, and based partly on self-loathing that made him believe she deserved better than vampire boyfriend, whose nature made him monster regardless of how carefully he controlled his thirst. The days following the birthday party were marked by Edward's emotional withdrawal and his careful construction of distance between himself and Bella, whose confusion about his changed behavior was obvious even without telepathy, to confirm what she was thinking or what she was feeling about his sudden coldness and his sudden reluctance to spend time with her or to engage with her beyond the minimum politeness that their continued interaction in school required, when they shared biology class and when avoiding her completely would have drawn more attention than his carefully calibrated distance that suggested cooling interest rather than deliberate abandonment being planned and being executed. According to strategy he had developed during sleepless nights, spent contemplating how to leave her in ways that would minimize her immediate pain while maximizing her long-term chances of recovery and of moving on to normal human life without vampire complications. He avoided her room at night for first time since they had begun their relationship. His absence from her window eliminating the routine of watching her sleep and eliminating the intimacy of their late-night conversations that had sustained their connection and had made their relationship feel real and sustainable. Despite the obvious obstacles and obvious dangers that he was now using as justification for ending what they had built together over the past 8 months since January, when Bella had first arrived in Forks and had first captured his attention through her silent mind and her appealing blood that had called to him with intensity that had defined their entire relationship. Alice's distress about Edward's plans was obvious in her thoughts and in her attempts to change his mind through arguments about Bella's feelings and about the damage that abandonment would cause compared to whatever dangers Edward believed he was protecting Bella from by leaving. Her visions showing futures where Bella survived Edward's departure, but where survival came at cost of depression and came at cost of psychological damage that Alice believed Edward would regret causing once he understood the full impact of his decision on Bella's mental health and Bella's future relationships and Bella's ability to trust or to love after being abandoned by a person she had committed to and had planned her future around despite the risks and despite the supernatural complications that made their relationship impossible according to every reasonable standard. Edward dismissed Alice's concerns as manipulative attempts to keep him in Forks for Alice's benefit rather than for Bella's benefit. His conviction that Bella would eventually recover and would eventually be grateful for his departure, making him deaf to warnings about immediate harm he would cause through abandonment that would feel like rejection and would feel like punishment for being human and for having the birthday party that had led to Jasper's attack and had revealed the fundamental incompatibility between Bella's humanity and the Cullen family's predatory natures. The breakup happened in the forest behind Bella's house, where Edward had walked with her on pretense of wanting private conversation. The location chosen specifically to be away from Charlie's house and away from witnesses who might intervene or might provide Bella with immediate support. After Edward delivered the news that he was leaving and that she should not try to follow him or try to contact him because their relationship was ending permanently and completely and without possibility of reconciliation or reunion. His prepared speech focused on lies designed to make her believe that he had never loved her as intensely as she loved him. His claim that she was merely distraction or diversion meant to hurt her enough that she would not pursue him and would not wait for him to return and would instead move on with her human life and would find human boyfriend who could give her normal relationship without supernatural complications or supernatural dangers that Edward's presence created. The words felt like poison in his mouth as he spoke them. Watching Bella's face crumble and watching her hope die as she processed his claims that he did not want her to come with him and that he did not want her in his life anymore and that what they had shared had been pleasant but ultimately insufficient to justify continuing relationship, that required too much effort and created too many complications for his family who wanted to move on and wanted to live without human entanglements. Her whispered question about whether he wanted her received his coldest lie in response, his vague phrasing giving her nothing to hold on to and nothing to argue against when he turned and walked away from her, standing alone in the forest, where he had brought her specifically to abandon her far enough from home that she would have to walk back alone and would have time to process the breakup before reaching the safety of her house and the comfort of her father, who would never understand what had happened or why his daughter was suddenly devastated. The family's immediate departure from Forks happened within hours of the breakup, their preparations already completed and their plans already finalized before Edward had delivered the news to Bella, because the decision had been made days earlier during the family discussions following the birthday party, when they had agreed that staying in Forks with Bella, representing constant temptation and constant danger, was unsustainable. They sold the house through rapid transaction that Alice had foreseen and had arranged, their departure erasing all traces of Cullen presence from Forks and leaving only memories and leaving only rumors about the beautiful family that had arrived mysteriously and had departed just as mysteriously after less than a year of residence. Carlyle contacted the hospital to explain his sudden departure and to make arrangements for his replacement, his reputation ensuring that his abrupt exit would not create suspicion beyond the inconvenience of losing skilled physician. Moving to Ithaca, New York provided the family with new location and new identities for another cycle of high school and another cycle of pretending to be human teenagers attending classes and participating in social rituals that had become mechanical after decades of repetition. Carlyle took position at Cornell University's medical facilities, his credentials making placement easy despite the short notice. The family settled into a new house that Esme purchased and began renovating, her design work providing distraction that made the transition easier than it might have been if they had simply sat contemplating Edward's emotional state that was deteriorating rapidly. Edward's complete withdrawal from normal vampire activities shocked the family with its intensity and its duration. His refusal to hunt, and his refusal to engage with anyone, and his habit of sitting motionless for weeks at a time, suggesting depression or breakdown that went beyond normal sadness about ended relationship, and that suggested fundamental crisis about his existence and his choices and his ability to continue functioning. He sat in his room staring at nothing while his body slowly weakened from lack of blood, his eyes going black and his skin going grey in ways that indicated severe depletion that would require intervention if it continued. The extent of his depression manifested in his complete silence, his refusal to speak or to respond to family members, making Esme particularly distressed because her maternal instincts made watching Edward suffer feel unbearable. His mind replayed every memory of Bella with perfect vampire recall, the images and sensations and conversations cycling endlessly through his consciousness, while he sat frozen, refusing to acknowledge that time was passing, or that his family was worried, or that his behavior was becoming dangerous. Alice's visions were blocked whenever they involved Bella, the precognition showing nothing but darkness when Alice tried to see Bella's future, or tried to confirm whether Edward's departure had actually improved Bella's situation, the way Edward had convinced himself it would. The blocking happened whenever Bella spent time with Jacob Black, whose werewolf nature interfered with Alice's gift and created blind spots that made tracking Bella's well-being impossible. Edward's panic about Bella potentially being dead emerged from Alice's inability to see her. His assumption that the darkness in Alice's visions meant death rather than meaning werewolf interference, creating terror that made his depression even worse as he contemplated that his attempt to save Bella by leaving her might have resulted in her death anyway, through mechanisms he had not anticipated. The irony of potentially causing the outcome he had been trying to prevent through his departure made his guilt unbearable and made his existence feel like punishment that he deserved. March of 2006 brought Alice's sudden vision of Bella jumping off a cliff into the ocean below. The precognitive image showing Bella's body falling through the air and disappearing into the churning water that Alice's gift could not see past, because the vision ended with Bella's impact with the water and did not continue to show whether Bella survived or whether Bella drowned beneath the waves. Alice's immediate assumption was death, the vision's abrupt ending, suggesting that Bella's future had terminated at the moment of impact, or at the moment of drowning beneath the surface where Alice's precognition could not follow. The vision came during ordinary afternoon in Ithaca, when nothing had suggested that this particular day would bring news that would shatter what remained of Edward's fragile emotional stability. She left school immediately without explanation, her drive home urgent and her mind already planning the trip to Forks to verify what her vision had shown and to attend whatever funeral services Charlie would arrange. The week she spent contemplating the trip was torture. Her turmoil about how to tell Edward that Bella was dead and how to manage his response that would certainly involve complete breakdown and would possibly involve suicidal ideation consuming her thoughts. Edward's reaction to the news of Bella's death happened before Alice could deliver the information directly. His eavesdropping on Alice's thoughts during her contemplation, revealing the vision and revealing Alice's conclusion that Bella had drowned, and revealing Alice's plans to attend funeral. The complete shutdown of Edward's consciousness happened immediately upon understanding that Bella was dead, his mind going blank in ways that terrified Alice when she realized he had overheard and when she saw his expression suggesting he had left his body or had retreated into internal spaces where reality could not reach him. The suicidal ideation that followed Edward's initial shock manifested as systematic consideration of methods that Vampire could use to end his own existence, given that normal suicide methods would not work on body that could heal from most physical trauma. The plan to go to Volterra and to provoke the Volturi into executing him emerged as the most reliable method of achieving death that Edward desired, as escape from existence that had become unbearable without Bella, and that would remain unbearable for eternity stretching ahead with no possibility of reunion. His call to Rosalie from Rio de Janeiro, where he was planning his trip to Italy, represented attempt to communicate goodbye to Carlyle through intermediary, who would deliver message after Edward's death, prevented direct communication. His request that Rosalie tell Carlyle that Edward loved him and appreciated everything Carlyle had done for him across the decades. Since Edward's transformation sounding enough like farewell, that Rosalie should have realized immediately what Edward was planning, but that Rosalie interpreted as simply emotional expression from Vampire, who was grieving and who wanted to make sure his family knew his feelings in case something happened during his travels. Her failure to recognize the suicidal implications of Edward's call, and her failure to alert Alice or alert Carlyle about Edward's mental state, represented tragic miscommunication that nearly resulted in Edward's death before Alice's subsequent vision revealed what was happening, and revealed that intervention was necessary to prevent Edward from successfully provoking the Volturi into executing him for the exposure that would force their hand and would make his death inevitable according to vampire law that prohibited revealing their existence to humans under penalty of immediate execution without appeals or without mercy. Alice's vision of Edward in Volterra, planning to expose himself in sunlight during the St. Marcus Day festival, showed her exactly what Edward was planning, and showed her exactly how much time remained before Edward would walk into the plaza and would remove his shirt and would step into sunlight in front of thousands of tourists and local residents who would witness his sparkling skin and would witness irrefutable proof that vampires existed and that supernatural beings lived among human populations without humans knowing or understanding the predators who walked beside them, pretending to be human while possessing abilities and possessing natures that made them apex predators capable of killing with ease that humans could never match or could never defend against. The vision came with barely enough time for Alice to intervene if she acted immediately, and if she could convince Edward to abort his plan before he had committed to exposure, that would trigger Volturi response that Edward desired as a mechanism for achieving death, that he could not accomplish alone given vampire bodies' resistance to most forms of self-destruction, and given that he lacked the will or the means to provoke other vampires into killing him through combat or through the kind of territorial dispute that might result in his dismemberment and burning. Alice's frantic call to Edward's phone reaching him just as he was preparing to leave his hotel room and to walk to Plaza, where the festival was reaching its peak attendance, and where maximum witnesses would observe his exposure and would make denial or cover-up impossible, even for the Volturi, whose resources and whose influence were extensive but were not unlimited when dealing with thousands of witnesses who would have photographic evidence and who would have shared experience of seeing something that challenged every assumption about what was possible and what was real in a world governed by natural laws. Alice's desperate claim that Bella was alive and that the vision had been misunderstood represented truth that Alice had only recently discovered through her conversation with Jacob Black, who had answered Bella's phone when Alice called to verify the funeral arrangements and to speak with Charlie about memorial service details that would need to be coordinated if Alice was going to attend and pay respects on behalf of the Cullen family, who had known Bella and who had cared about her, even if their departure had suggested otherwise. Jacob's statement that Charlie was at the funeral had been misunderstood by Alice as referring to Bella's funeral when actually Jacob had meant Harry Clearwater's funeral. The miscommunication resulting from Jacob's anger about Alice's call and from Jacob's deliberate vagueness about whose funeral Charlie was attending, because Jacob wanted the vampires to stay away from Fawkes and wanted Bella to move on from Edward without renewed contact that would reopen wounds and would restart relationship that Jacob believed was unhealthy and was dangerous for Bella, whose depression during Edward's absence had been severe enough to worry Jacob and to worry Charlie and to worry everyone who cared about her. and who had watched her withdraw into herself in ways that suggested she might never fully recover from the abandonment. Edward's disbelief of Alice's claim that Bella was alive stemmed from his conviction that Alice's visions had never been wrong before, and that the vision of Bella jumping from the cliff must have meant death, even if Alice was now claiming otherwise. His suspicion that Alice was lying to prevent his suicide, making him dismiss her explanations, and making him continue with his plan to expose himself despite Alice's increasingly frantic attempts to convince him that Bella was genuinely alive and genuinely waiting for him if he would just abort the suicide plan and would just return to the United States to verify the truth of Alice's claims. Edward's decision to continue to Volterra despite Alice's claims represented his inability to believe that Bella could be alive when Alice's vision had shown her jumping, and when the logical interpretation of that vision was death rather than survival. His grief and his desire for death overriding his normal rationality and overriding his normal trust in Alice's visions that had proven accurate countless times across the decades since Alice had joined the family and had become trusted source of information about futures that her precognition revealed with reliability, that made her gift invaluable for planning and for avoiding dangers that would otherwise have caught them by surprise. He traveled to Italy with determination to complete his plan, regardless of what Alice claimed and regardless of whether some small possibility existed that Bella was actually alive. His conviction that existence without Bella was unbearable, making him willing to risk being wrong, if it meant ending the suffering that consumed every moment of his consciousness since learning about her presumed death. Volterra appeared ancient and appeared imposing when Edward arrived in the Tuscan city that had served as Volturi headquarters for 3,000 years. The medieval architecture and the narrow streets creating atmosphere of timelessness and creating sense of permanence that matched the Volturi's conception of themselves as eternal rulers of vampire civilization who had maintained order and had maintained secrecy and had maintained the careful balance between vampire existence and human ignorance that allowed both species to coexist without the kind of open warfare that would inevitably result if humans understood what lived among them and what preyed upon them without their knowledge or their consent. Edward made his way to the palace where Aro and Caius and Marcus held court. His request for meeting granted immediately, because the Volturi always received visitors who came seeking their judgment or seeking their favor or seeking their mercy that was rarely granted, but that was always formally considered before being denied through the elaborate courtesy that characterized vampire royalty's interactions with subjects who came to them with petitions or with problems that required ancient wisdom or ancient authority to resolve. His request for execution was unusual, but was not unprecedented. Vampires occasionally seeking death through Volturi intervention, when other methods proved unavailable or proved too difficult to accomplish alone, given that vampire bodies resisted most conventional forms of self-destruction, and given that provoking other vampires into killing them required skill or required circumstances that not every suicidal vampire possessed or could create. Aro's curiosity about why Carlyle's talented son would be seeking death, making him agree to the meeting, and making him agree to hear Edward's request, even though the outcome was already determined by Aro's interest in Edward's gift, and by Ara's long-standing desire to add Edward to the Volturi Guard, where his telepathy would complement Ara's own gift, and would provide redundancy, and would provide tactical advantages that mind reading offered in conflicts or in negotiations, where knowing what opponents were thinking provided decisive edge that could mean difference between victory and defeat. The meeting with Aro and Marcus and Caius in the throne room was brief and was unsatisfying for Edward, who had expected either immediate execution or immediate agreement to execute him during the festival. Aro's fascination with Edward's mind, when touching Edward's hand and reading every thought and every memory, giving Aro complete understanding of Edward's situation and complete understanding of why Edward was seeking death, but not giving Aro any inclination to grant the request when Edward was valuable, and when Edward's death would waste gift that Aro had coveted since Carlyle had first told him about his talented son decades ago during one of Carlyle's periodic visits to Volterra to maintain friendly relations with the vampire authority. Aro's refusal to execute Edward and Aro's suggestion that Edward should reconsider his request and should return to his family represented diplomatic rejection that left Edward with no option except to pursue his backup plan of exposing himself in sunlight during the festival, where thousands of witnesses would force Aro's hand and would make execution necessary to maintain vampire secrecy that the Volturi's laws existed to protect, and that the Volturi's existence depended upon maintaining through enforcement that was swift and was absolute when violations occurred. Edward's walk toward the plaza and toward the sunlight happened with deliberate slowness as he unbuttoned his shirt and prepared to step from the shadows of the alley into the bright sunlight of the festival, where tourists crowded the square celebrating St. Marcus Day with pageantry and with historical reenactments that ironically celebrated the city's supposed protection from vampire attack centuries ago, when in reality vampires had ruled the city continuously since before the Christian era, and when the festival itself represented elaborate fiction that humans had constructed to explain events they could not understand and could not accurately remember across generations of oral tradition that had distorted truth into legend. His plan to expose himself in front of maximum witnesses would force the Volturi to execute him publicly, or would force them to kill all the witnesses and to execute him privately, either outcome resulting in Edward's death, that he desired as release from existence, that had lost all meaning and all purpose when Bella had died, or when Edward believed Bella had died, based on Alice's vision and based on the reasonable interpretation that jumping from cliff meant suicide meant death, rather than meaning the recreational cliff diving that Bella had actually been engaging in with Jacob and with the other Quileute teenagers who used the cliffs at La Push as entertainment and as test of courage. Bella's arrival in the plaza happened seconds before Edward would have stepped into sunlight. Her running through the crowd and her throwing herself in front of him, physically blocking his path to the sunlight and physically preventing his exposure, creating confusion and creating hope and creating terror all simultaneously as Edward processed that Bella was alive and was here and was real, rather than being hallucination or ghost or cruel trick that his grieving mind had created to torture him with possibility of salvation that did not actually exist. The moment of reunion was suspended outside time as Edward stared at Bella, trying to understand how she could be alive when Alice's vision had shown her jumping and when logic had suggested she was dead, his whispered acknowledgement that she was here, meeting her breathless confirmation that she was present and was real, and was preventing his suicide through her physical presence, that made continued exposure impossible, without exposing her as well to the danger of Volturi attention and Volturi judgment about why human girl knew about vampires and knew enough to travel to Italy to prevent vampire suicide. The Volturi guards' retrieval of Edward and Bella from the plaza happened quickly and happened efficiently as Jane and Alec and Dimitri and Felix emerged from the shadows and escorted them back to the palace, where Aro would want to examine the situation more carefully and would want to understand why human girl possessed knowledge of vampires and possessed relationship with Cullen family member that had motivated her to travel internationally to prevent his suicide attempt that had nearly succeeded, and that would have created enormous problems for the Volturi if Edward had managed to expose himself before Bella's intervention. Alice's arrival at the palace slightly ahead of Edward and Bella's escort allowed her to prepare Aro for the situation and allowed her to begin negotiations about how to resolve the problem of Bella's knowledge without requiring Bella's death, that Edward would fight to prevent, and that would create conflict between the Cullens and the Volturi that neither side particularly wanted, despite the tensions and despite the fundamental disagreement about whether humans who knew about vampires should be allowed to live. The throne room meeting involved Aro's fascination with touching Edward's hand again and reading the updated memories that included Bella and included Edward's love for her and included his suicide attempt and included everything that had happened since Aro had last seen Edward decades ago when he had been visiting Volterra with Carlyle. Aro's interest in Bella herself led to his request to touch her hand and to read her thoughts the way he had read Edward's thoughts. His surprise and his frustration when he discovered that Bella's mind was closed to him the same way it was closed to Edward, representing rare experience of an encountering human whose natural mental shield blocked even Aro's powerful gift that normally gave him access to every thought and every memory of anyone he touched. The ultimatum about Bella came after Aro's failed attempt to read her mind. His declaration that she must eventually be transformed or must be killed to protect the vampire secret representing conditional release that allowed the Cullens to leave Volterra. But that created obligation and created timeline for Bella's transformation that could not be indefinitely delayed without risking Volturi enforcement. The flight home to the United States happened with mixture of relief and apprehension as Edward and Bella and Alice traveled together from Italy back to Washington State, where their lives would resume with the added burden of the Volturi's ultimatum hanging over them like sword that would eventually fall if they did not comply with the requirement that Bella be transformed or be killed to protect the vampire secret that her knowledge threatened regardless of her promises to remain silent or her demonstrated loyalty during the Italy crisis that had proven her commitment to Edward and to preserving his existence even at risk to her own safety. Edward's relief at having Bella alive and having her safe overwhelmed his previous conviction that staying away from her was the right choice or was the protective choice. His months of suffering during their separation, having taught him that leaving her did not actually protect her from danger and did not actually improve her life in ways that justified the pain that abandonment had caused both of them. and had nearly caused their permanent separation through his suicide that would have succeeded if Bella had not arrived in time to prevent his exposure. The hours of forced proximity on the flight provided opportunity for Edward and Bella to begin processing what had happened and to begin rebuilding the relationship that Edward's departure had damaged in ways that would require time and trust to repair fully. The wounds from abandonment not healing instantly simply because they were reunited and simply because the immediate crisis had been resolved through their escape from Volterra. With their lives intact and with the Volturi's conditional approval to continue existing as long as they eventually complied with the transformation requirement. Edward's comprehensive apologies during the flight and during the subsequent days after their return to Forks were sincere in ways that surprised Bella, who had expected anger or resentment about her cliff jumping and about her reckless behavior that had inadvertently led to the Italy crisis through the misunderstanding about whether she had died or had survived the jump that Alice's visions had shown, but hadn't shown the outcome of because Jacob's werewolf presence had blocked the precognition and had created the darkness that Alice had interpreted as death rather than as interference. Edward's acknowledgement of his mistake in leaving her and his acknowledgement that his attempt to protect her had actually endangered her and had actually caused the suffering he had been trying to prevent represented growth and represented humility that his century of existence had not previously taught him, because his experiences before Bella had not included loving someone enough that their pain became more important than his own judgment about what was best for them and about how to protect them from dangers that he perceived as threats, even when the greatest threat came from his own choices rather than from external forces. His realization that Bella's choices about her own life deserved respect, even when those choices involved risk or involved accepting dangers that Edward would prefer to shield her from, marked shift in his understanding of their relationship and marked shift in his willingness to accept that Bella was autonomous, being whose agency mattered as much as Edward's protective instincts mattered, regardless of how strong those instincts were or how convinced he was that he knew better than she did about what would keep her safe. The metaphor he offered about his life before Bella being like moonless night and about Bella shooting across his sky like meteor captured the transformation she had brought to his existence and captured the impossibility of returning to the darkness once he had experienced the light she represented in ways that made his previous century of existence seem like mere waiting or mere preparation for the moment when she would arrive and would teach him that redemption was possible even for monsters who had killed and who had believed themselves damned beyond salvation. The poetic expression was genuine rather than manipulative. Edward's tendency toward romantic language emerging from his 1918 upbringing when eloquent expression was valued and when declarations of love required more than simple statements of feeling, but required demonstration of that feeling through carefully chosen words that conveyed depth and conveyed commitment beyond what casual modern language typically achieved in era, when communication had become abbreviated and had become less formal. Bella's acceptance of his apology and her willingness to rebuild their relationship despite the pain he had caused represented either remarkable forgiveness or remarkable foolishness, depending on perspective. Her love for Edward apparently sufficient to override reasonable caution about whether he would abandon her again when circumstances made staying seem too dangerous or too complicated for the vampire family, whose existence depended on maintaining secrecy and maintaining the careful balance between living among humans and avoiding the kind of exposure that would force them to leave locations where they had established lives. The new terms of their relationship reflected Edward's acceptance that Bella would eventually be transformed despite his previous absolute opposition to the idea, his experience in Volterra having taught him that the Volturi's ultimatum left no alternative except transformation or death, and that choosing Bella's death to preserve her humanity represented insanity rather than protection, given that Bella herself wanted transformation and wanted immortality with Edward, even at cost of her human experiences and her human future. Edward's conditions for agreeing to transformation represented his attempt to give Bella human experiences before she became vampire. His insistence on marriage before transformation emerging from his old-fashioned values and his 1918 upbringing that viewed marriage as necessary precursor to intimacy and as necessary foundation for the kind of permanent commitment that transformation would create between them, regardless of whether legal marriage preceded the biological bond. His proposal that they marry before he transformed her surprised Bella, whose modern sensibilities made marriage seem unnecessary or seem like outdated institution that contemporary couples could forego without social consequences or without moral implications that Edward's generation had associated with unmarried cohabitation or unmarried intimacy that would have been scandalous in his time, but that was completely normal in Bella's time, when societal expectations about relationships had changed dramatically. Bella's resistance to marriage stemmed partly from her parents' failed marriage that had shaped her, understanding of matrimony as institution that often ended in divorce and often caused more pain than it prevented, her observation of Charlie and Renee's incompatibility and their subsequent decades of living separately, having taught her that marriage promises were easily broken and that legal contract did not ensure emotional commitment or ensure lasting happiness in ways that would make the ceremony worthwhile or would make the public declaration meaningful beyond the social ritual. Edward's perspective on marriage came from entirely different cultural contexts where divorce was scandalous and where marriage represented sacred commitment that couples entered with expectation of permanence rather than with backup plans for dissolution if relationship proved unsatisfying. His belief that marriage mattered representing fundamental values that had been shaped by his human upbringing and that transformation had not erased despite the decades that had passed since he had been part of human society that observed these traditions. The negotiation between their different values and their different cultural backgrounds regarding marriage represented broader negotiation about how vampire and human would merge their lives when vampire carried values from early 20th century and human carried values from early 21st century that differed fundamentally about gender roles and about institutional commitments and about whether traditions mattered or whether modern pragmatism should govern their choices about how to structure their relationship. Edward's romantic vision of proper courtship leading to marriage before intimacy, before the permanent bond transformation, would create reflected his deeply held beliefs about the right way to honor their relationship and to honor Bella through formal commitment that his generation viewed as essential rather than optional. while Bella's pragmatic view that marriage was just legal paperwork and unnecessary formality when they were already committed and already planning eternal future together, reflected her generation's different approach to relationships and to the markers of commitment. The compromise eventually reached involved Bella agreeing to marry Edward if he agreed to transform her himself after appropriate human experiences that Edward insisted she have before losing humanity permanently. The negotiated settlement satisfying neither of them completely, but representing the kind of mutual accommodation that relationships required when partners came from different backgrounds and held different values about important life decisions. Spring of 2006 brought comfortable period as they settled back into patterns that felt familiar. Even though everything had changed beneath the surface, Edward's renewed presence in Bella's life, welcomed by Bella but viewed with suspicion by Charlie, who had watched his daughter suffer during Edward's absence and who wasn't convinced that Edward deserved second chance after abandoning Bella in ways that had caused depression severe enough to worry everyone who cared about her. The Jacob Black complication intensified during the spring months as Bella's friendship with Jacob developed into something that Edward recognized as genuine romantic rival, despite his previous dismissal of human boys as potential threats to his relationship with Bella. Jacob's werewolf nature making him different from normal humans and making him capable of offering Bella things that Edward could never provide, including warmth and including the possibility of normal human life with normal aging and with children that vampire Edward could never give her, regardless of how much he wanted to provide everything she desired. Reading Jacob's thoughts when they encountered each other revealed the depth of Jacob's love for Bella and revealed Jacob's hope that she would eventually choose him over Edward. Once she recognized that Jacob represented future that included humanity and included all the experiences that transformation would steal from her permanently. The werewolf's confidence in his own appeal and his confidence that Bella's attraction to Edward was based partly on supernatural influence rather than on genuine compatibility, creating resentment in Edward, who wanted to believe that Bella's love for him was authentic. The treaty with the Quileute werewolves that prevented cold ones from entering Quileute land created practical barrier that prevented Edward from following Bella when she visited Jacob on the reservation. His frustration at being unable to monitor her safety and unable to read Jacob's thoughts when they were together, making him anxious in ways that he recognized were possessive, but that he could not fully overcome, despite recognizing that Bella deserved freedom to maintain friendships without Edward's constant supervision. The tension between Edward and Jacob whenever they encountered each other at the boundary line represented clash between two beings who both loved Bella and who both believed they knew what was best for her and who both viewed the other as threat to her well-being and to her future. Edward seeing Jacob as temptation toward humanity that would be safer for Bella, but would separate them permanently, while Jacob saw Edward as predator, who was manipulating Bella into accepting transformation that would destroy her humanity and would condemn her to existence as monster. May and June of 2006 brought the Seattle newborn army crisis to Edward's attention through Alice's visions of army being created and being directed toward a purpose that remained unclear in the precognitive images that showed chaos and showed violence, but did not show clear motivation or clear target for the organized newborn force that someone was creating deliberately in numbers that suggested military purpose. Edward's analysis of the situation, through Alice's visions and through reports from other vampires who had noticed the unusual activity in Seattle, led him to conclude that someone was creating newborns deliberately and was creating them in numbers that suggested organized attack rather than simple maker losing control of their creations. The pattern of killings and the pattern of disappearances indicating systematic creation of newborn army. The realization that Victoria was behind the newborn army came through combination of Alice's visions and through Edward's deductive reasoning about who would have motivation to create army targeting the Cullens and targeting Bella specifically in revenge for James's death during the ballet studio confrontation that had ended Victoria's mate's existence and had created the kind of loss that vampire culture and vampire psychology made into consuming need for vengeance. Victoria's strategy of using newborns to overwhelm the Cullens demonstrated tactical intelligence that Edward had not credited her with during their previous encounters. Her ability to stay hidden from Alice's visions through constantly changing her decisions, making her difficult to track and difficult to predict in ways that made planning defense against her attack complicated. Edward's alliance with Jacob's werewolf pack against common enemy represented unprecedented cooperation between species that had historically been enemies and that had maintained tense peace through treaty that both sides respected, out of pragmatic recognition that warfare would cost more than peace cost. The training sessions where Jasper taught the werewolves how to fight newborn vampires using techniques he had learned during the Southern Vampire Wars, creating strange scene of traditional enemies working together. The camping trip strategy for protecting Bella during the battle involved taking her away from the fight and hiding her scent to prevent Victoria from tracking her directly. The plan requiring Edward to miss the battle to serve as Bella's personal guard while his family and the werewolf pack dealt with a newborn army. Edward's proposal to Bella happened during the tent scene, when desperation and jealousy and fear of losing her to Jacob made him offer her everything she had asked for, including agreement to transform her himself if she would marry him first, and would give him the reassurance that legal and social commitment would provide, even though vampire mating bonds did not require human marriage ceremonies to be permanent. Bella's acceptance of the proposal represented victory for Edward's patience and represented Bella's recognition that marriage to Edward was small price to pay for immortality with him, and for the future they would build together across centuries. The battle against Victoria's newborn army happened without Edward's participation. His role as Bella's protector keeping him away from the fight, while Jasper's training and the werewolves' natural abilities allowed the combined force to destroy the newborns efficiently. Victoria's arrival with Riley Beers as backup represented final confrontation between Edward and the vampire who blamed him for James's death. Edward's destruction of Victoria, with Seth's assistance, eliminated the threat permanently and eliminated the revenge motivation that had driven Victoria's systematic planning. Summer of 2006 brought wedding planning that Alice orchestrated with enthusiasm that reflected her genuine joy at finally having occasion to plan elaborate celebration. Edward's excitement about marrying Bella, representing triumph of his old-fashioned values and representing fulfillment of courtship that had arrived eventually at the traditional destination of marriage that Edward's upbringing insisted should precede the intimacy and the permanent commitment that transformation would create between them. Edward Cullen's story was never just about falling in love with human girl, but was about century-long journey from believing himself damned to discovering redemption was possible through choosing compassion over instinct and through loving the one mind he could never read. The truth we never saw was his internal war every moment with Bella, between the monster who wanted to drain her and the man who wanted to cherish her. His telepathy meaning he experienced everyone's truth except his own, until Bella's silent mind taught him that mystery mattered more than certainty, and that love required faith, not just knowledge. The timeline we thought we knew was Bella's perspective, but Edward's truth revealed every hidden struggle and every moment of barely controlled thirst, and every decision weighing her life against his desires, and every guilt-laden memory of the approximately 100 lives he had taken during his rebellion that haunted him across decades of attempting atonement through vegetarian lifestyle that could never fully erase what he had done or who he had been when he had believed that being predator meant being judge and being executioner. So rest now, Twilight souls, knowing that even those who hear every thought but their own can find the one voice that teaches them to listen with their heart instead of with their gift. Let Edward's hidden truths and his century of searching carry you gently into sleep, where your own mysteries wait to be discovered by someone worthy of not knowing everything. Good night.